The rifle was still warm in my hands when I heard my own voice calling from somewhere deep in the tree line. That is not a metaphor. That is not dramatic license. I heard my own voice, clear as morning water, calling my name from a place I had not been, in a direction I had not walked, while I stood perfectly still beside a fire that had just gone cold for no reason at all. I need you to understand that before I tell you anything else. I need you to sit with that for a moment and decide whether you want to keep listening, because everything that happened at Harper's Ferry started with that sound, and everything that came after it was worse. It was Geronimo who organized the trip. He had been talking about it since March, sending photos of the ridgeline above the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, the place where 3 states meet in a tangle of history and old-growth timber. West Virginia, Maryland. He said the hunting would be world-class. White-tailed deer moving through the river valleys in the early mornings, wild turkey in the hardwood hollows, maybe even black bear if we pushed far enough into the backcountry above Loudon Heights. He had rented a series of cabins on a private tract of land about 6 miles northwest of the historic district, deep enough into the forest that cell service dropped to nothing, and the only road in was a single lane of packed gravel that wound through the trees like a scar. There were 10 of us, Geronimo, obviously, Cochise, who had been hunting with Geronimo for years and could track a deer through solid rock, Victorio, the most cautious person I have ever met in my life, the kind of man who checks the weather forecast 11 times before leaving his house, Nana, who was the oldest in our group by 15 years and had spent more time in the wilderness than the rest of us combined, Mangas Coloradas, built like a wall and afraid of absolutely nothing, or so he claimed, Ja, who barely spoke but noticed everything, the kind of person whose silence made you nervous because you knew he was seeing things you were not, Lozan, the only one among us who had any real intuition, the person who would stop walking in the middle of a trail and say something feels wrong about this direction and be right every single time, Chato, the skeptic, the one who laughed at campfire stories and said the only monsters in the woods were the ones carrying hunting licenses, Naish, the youngest, eager and fast and always volunteering for the farthest scouting routes, and Goyakla, who knew the local folklore better than anyone should, who had spent years collecting stories from old-timers in the Appalachian communities about the things that lived in the hollows and the gaps and the unnamed ridges where the forest grew so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. We arrived on a Thursday in late July. The heat was obscene, the kind of humidity that wraps around your chest and refuses to let go. The cabins were old but solid, pine walls, tin roofs, wood-burning stoves that we would not need for another 2 months. The property sat at the end of that gravel road, in a clearing surrounded on 3 sides by mixed hardwood forest, mostly oak and hickory and tulip poplar, with a steep ravine dropping away to the south toward a creek that I could hear but never see from the cabins. The 4th side faced a meadow that ran about 200 yards before the trees closed in again, and that meadow was where Geronimo said we would set up our primary hunting blinds. The first evening was normal, better than normal. We grilled venison sausage that Cochise had brought from a previous hunt, drank cold drinks from coolers packed so tight with ice that they weighed more than our gear bags, and sat around a fire pit that someone had built from river stones in the center of the clearing. Goyakla started telling stories almost immediately. That was his nature. He could not sit beside a fire without reaching for some piece of old history, some fragment of legend that he had picked up from a gas station conversation or a library book or a late-night internet search that had gone too deep. That night he told us about the things the old-timers called shape-changers, beings that could wear the skin of an animal or a person, beings that moved through the forest the way a disease moves through a body, quietly, deliberately, with patience that no living creature should possess. Chato laughed and threw a bottle cap at him. Victorio looked uncomfortable. Nana stared at the fire and said nothing, which was unusual for Nana, who usually had an opinion about everything. I remember Lozan asking Goyakla a question that I did not think much of at the time but have thought about every single day since. "How do you know if one is near you?" Lozan asked. Goyakla looked at Lozan for a long time before answering. He said, "You do not until it wants you to. And by then, the thing standing in front of you might be wearing the face of someone you trust." We laughed. Most of us laughed. Nana did not laugh. Ju did not laugh. And I noticed, even then, that the creek at the bottom of the ravine had gone silent at some point during the story, and I could not remember exactly when. The next morning we split into 3 groups. Geronimo took Cochise and Nish along the ridgeline to the east, following deer trails that Cochise had identified from satellite images before the trip. Mangus Coloradus went with Victorio and Chato into the hardwood hollow to the north, where the turkey sign was thick and the canopy dropped low enough to create natural corridors. That left me with Nana, Jew, Lozin, and Goyakla, and we took the southern route, down toward the creek and then along its bank, heading west, into a part of the forest that none of us had seen before. The morning was still and hot. The humidity was already climbing by 6:30, and by 8 the air felt like something you could chew. Nana set a steady pace, his boots finding the trail with a precision that came from decades of walking through terrain like this. Jew moved behind him like a shadow, scanning the underbrush with those quiet eyes. Lozin walked beside me, and I noticed early on that Lozin kept pausing, tilting ahead slightly, as if listening for something that the rest of us could not hear. We reached the creek by 9. It was wider than I expected, maybe 20 feet across, running shallow over a bed of gray and brown stones that looked like they had been there since the world was young. The water was clear enough to see the bottom everywhere, and nothing was moving in it. No minnows, no crawdads, no water striders on the surface. The creek was completely still except for the current itself, and that stillness felt wrong in a way that I could not articulate. Goyakla was the first to say something. He stopped at the edge of the bank and crouched down and stared at the water for nearly a full minute. Then he said, "Nothing is drinking from this creek." I looked at the banks. He was right. There were no tracks, no deer prints, no raccoon prints, no bird tracks, nothing. The mud on either side was smooth and untouched, as if every animal in the forest had decided to avoid this particular stretch of water. Nana said maybe the water was bad, contaminated from old mining operations upstream. That was plausible. Harper's Ferry had a long history of industry, and abandoned mines dotted the mountains throughout the region, but Goyakla shook his head. He said the water looked clean. He said the problem was not the water. The problem was whatever had made the animals decide the water was not worth the risk. We followed the creek west for about a mile. The forest on both sides grew denser, the canopy closing in until the light took on that green, filtered quality that makes everything feel like it exists underwater. I was watching the tree line to our left when Jew stopped walking. He did not say anything. He just stopped. And when I turned to look at him, he was staring at a spot about 40 yards into the trees with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not fear, exactly. It was recognition, like he was seeing something he had seen before in a dream and had hoped was not real. I followed his gaze. For a moment I saw nothing, just trees, underbrush, the usual tangle of mountain forest. Then I saw it. Something was standing between 2 large oak trees, partially hidden by the trunk of the nearest one. It was tall, taller than any person I had ever seen. Its proportions were wrong in a way that made my eyes hurt, like my brain was trying to process a shape that did not conform to anything in its catalog of known forms. The coloring blended with the bark of the trees so perfectly that if Jew had not stopped, if I had not looked at exactly the right spot at exactly the right moment, I would have walked past it without ever knowing it was there. It did not move. It stood there with a stillness that was more absolute than the stillness of the creek, more absolute than the stillness of the air, the kind of stillness that living things are not supposed to achieve. I opened my mouth to say something, and Jew grabbed my arm. He squeezed hard enough to leave bruises that I would find later that evening. He shook his head once. "Do not speak. Do not acknowledge it." I understood the instruction even though he did not say a word. We kept walking. Lozin moved closer to me and whispered, "It is still watching us." I did not turn around. I could feel the truth of that statement on the back of my neck like a physical weight, like someone pressing 2 fingers against my spine. When we got back to camp that afternoon, Geronimo was already there with Cochise and Nish. They had not found any deer, not a single one. No tracks, no scat, no browse marks on the vegetation. Cochise said it was like the deer had packed up and left overnight. Nish looked spooked, though he would not say why. It was not until later, after the sun had dropped behind the ridgeline and the shadows stretched across the clearing like reaching hands, that Nish told me he had heard someone calling his name from the bottom of a ravine while they were walking the eastern trail. He said it sounded like Geronimo's voice. He said Geronimo had been walking directly beside him when the voice called. Geronimo confirmed it. He had heard it too, his own voice, coming from somewhere below them, calling out a name that it had no right to know. The second night was when things stopped being strange and started being wrong. Mangus Coloradas, Victorio, and Chato returned to camp just before sundown. Victorio was pale. Not sunburned pale. The other kind. The kind where the blood retreats from the surface of the skin because the body is preparing for something that the conscious mind has not yet acknowledged. He sat down on the steps of his cabin and stared at the tree line without blinking for nearly 10 minutes before anyone could get him to speak. Chato told us what happened. They had been set up in the hollow, positioned along a natural corridor between two ridges, waiting for Turkey. The forest was quiet, which Chato said was normal for midday heat. But then the quiet changed. It went from the absence of sound to the presence of silence, and those are two very different things. Chato described it as feeling like the air had been packed with cotton, like pressure was building inside his skull. Mangus Coloradas felt it too. He stood up from his blind and looked around, and that was when Victorio made a sound that Chato said he would carry with him until the day he died. Victorio had been facing the ridge to the north. Something was standing at the top of that ridge, silhouetted against the sky. It was shaped like a person but moved like water, shifting and rippling at the edges as if its outline could not decide where it ended, and the air began. Victorio said it turned its head toward them, and when it did, its face was his face. His exact face. The same scar above the left eyebrow, the same set of the jaw, the same eyes, but the expression was empty. Not angry, not hungry, not curious. Empty, like a mask that had been put on a mannequin and forgotten there. Victorio ran. He did not decide to run. His legs made the decision for him. Mangus Coloradas and Chato followed, and they did not stop until they reached the gravel road. Chato said he looked back once. The thing on the ridge was gone, but there were footprints in the dirt where it had been standing, and the footprints were bare human feet, except each one had only 4 toes. Goyakla listened to all of this without interrupting. When Chato finished, Goyakla stood up and walked to his cabin and came back with a small leather pouch that he set on the table beside the fire pit. He said we needed to leave. Not tomorrow. Now. Tonight. He said the thing in the forest was a skinwalker, and he said that name with a weight that made the syllables sound like stones dropping into deep water. He said it had been watching us since we arrived. He said the empty creek, the missing animals, the voices calling names that did not belong to them, all of it was the same entity, testing us, learning us, figuring out which face to wear when it finally decided to walk into camp. Chato laughed. Even after what he had just experienced, Chato laughed. He said Goyakla was being dramatic. He said there were rational explanations for everything. The figure on the ridge was probably another hunter. The face was a trick of light and shadow and adrenaline. The voices were echoes bouncing through the hollows in ways that mountain terrain was known to produce. Nana told Chato to be quiet. I had never heard Nana speak with that tone before. It was the tone of someone who knew something they wished they did not know. Nana said he had encountered something similar 40 years ago in a different part of the Appalachians. He said the people he was with did not listen when they were told to leave. He said he was the only one who came out of those mountains, and he had never spoken about what happened to the others. He said he would not speak about it now either. All he would say was that Goyakla was right. We needed to go. Geronimo, to his credit, listened. He started organizing the group, assigning packing tasks, telling everyone to load the vehicles. We would drive out in convoy. Stay together. Stay in the light. Do not go into the trees alone for any reason. That was when Lozen said, "Where is Naish?" We counted heads. 9. Naish was gone. No one had seen him leave. No one had heard him leave. His gear was still in his cabin, his boots still beside the door. The only thing missing was Naish himself. Geronimo grabbed a flashlight and started toward the tree line. Cochise grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Do not go in there," Cochise said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "Whatever is in those trees took him because it wants us to follow. It wants us to come in one at a time. That is how it works. It separates. It isolates. It becomes someone you trust and leads you somewhere you cannot come back from." We stood in that clearing and called Naish's name until our throats ached. The forest answered with nothing, not even an echo. The trees swallowed the sound the way a mouth swallows food, completely and without effort. No one slept. We gathered in the largest cabin, all 9 of us pressed into a single room with every light on and every window locked and every curtain drawn shut. Geronimo sat by the door with his rifle across his knees. Cochise paced along the far wall like a caged animal, checking and rechecking the bolt on his own weapon. Victorio had not spoken since telling his story. He sat in the corner with his knees drawn up to his chest and his eyes fixed on the floor, and I was not sure he was entirely present anymore. The thing on the ridge wearing his face had taken something from him that I did not think he would ever get back. Mangus Coloradus wanted to go out and find Naish. He said it 3 times. Each time, either Nana or Goyakla talked him down. Goyakla explained that a skinwalker feeds on isolation. It mimics voices and faces specifically to draw individuals away from the group. The moment someone walks into those trees alone, they become vulnerable in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. Mangus Coloradus argued. He said he was not afraid. Nana looked at him with those old steady eyes and said, "That is exactly the problem. The ones who are not afraid are the ones it takes first, because they do not understand what they are dealing with." Around midnight, the first sound came. It started as footsteps on the gravel outside, slow, measured steps that circled the cabin in a pattern that was almost but not quite regular. The spacing between each step was slightly different each time, as if whatever was walking out there was experimenting with rhythm, trying to learn how a human being distributes weight when it moves. The footsteps went around the cabin 4 times. Then they stopped at the front door. There was a knock, 3 knocks, evenly spaced, and then Naish's voice, clear as glass, calling from the other side of the door. "Hey, let me in. I got turned around in the woods. Come on, open up. It is freezing out here." Geronimo did not move. His hands were steady on the rifle, but the muscles in his jaw were working hard, grinding back and forth like machinery under stress. He looked at Goyakla. Goyakla shook his head slowly. "That is not Naish," he said. The voice outside changed. It became agitated. "Guys, come on. What is wrong with you? Open the door. Why are you not opening the door?" The intonation was perfect. The vocabulary was perfect. But there was something underneath the words, something I could feel in my sternum, a vibration that did not match human vocal cords. It was like listening to a recording played back through a speaker that was slightly damaged, the sound almost right but carrying a frequency that made your teeth ache. Lozen covered both ears and pressed hard. "Do not listen to it," Lozen whispered. "It is not just talking. It is doing something with the sound." I could feel it too. The voice was not just trying to get us to open the door. It was trying to get inside our heads, finding cracks in our certainty, prying at the edges of our rational minds the way you might pry at the lid of a jar. The knocking stopped. The voice stopped. For about 20 minutes, there was nothing. Just the sound of 9 people breathing in a locked room and the distant pulse of insects in the meadow. Then Chato screamed. He was standing near the window on the north wall, the one where the curtain had a gap about 2 inches wide at the bottom. He had looked through that gap. And something had been looking back. He said it was pressed against the glass, its face inches from the window, and its face was his face. His own features arranged on a head that was too long and sat on a neck that bent at angles that no spine should allow. He said the eyes were the worst part. They were his eyes, the exact right color, the exact right shape, but they were empty of everything that makes eyes human. No thought, no soul, no recognition. Just 2 perfectly replicated organs sitting in a face that was borrowing his identity, the way someone might borrow a coat. Mangus Coloradus pulled Chato away from the window. Cochise drew the curtain shut completely. The room was silent except for Chato's breathing, which was coming in short, ragged bursts that sounded like they were being torn out of his chest. Ju spoke for the first time in hours. He said one word, "Listen." We listened. From outside, far away at first, but getting closer, we could hear voices, multiple voices, all of them ours. My voice saying sentences I had never spoken. Geronimo's voice giving orders he had never given. Cochise calling out coordinates to locations that did not exist. Lozen singing a song that none of us had ever heard. It was a chorus of stolen identities, a rehearsal of faces and voices and mannerisms that the thing in the forest had been collecting since the moment we arrived. Goyakla opened his leather pouch and began spreading something along the base of the door and the window frames. I asked him what it was. He said it did not matter what it was. He said what mattered was whether we could survive until morning, because these things do not operate in full sunlight, not because sunlight hurts them, but because sunlight makes it harder for them to maintain the illusion. Their stolen shapes do not hold as well when the light is strong and direct. We waited. The voices circled the cabin for hours, rising and falling, sometimes whispering, sometimes screaming. At one point I heard my own voice outside the cabin telling a joke I had told at dinner the night before, and it was told perfectly. Every pause, every inflection, every laugh at the end. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced, hearing myself exist in a place where I was not, being used as bait by something that had no right to any piece of who I was. The sun came up at 6:14. I know this because Ju had been watching the eastern window through the curtain gap with a focus so intense that it looked painful, and when the first thin line of gold appeared on the horizon, he announced the time with the precision of someone reading an instrument. The voices had stopped sometime around 4. The footsteps, the knocking, the sounds of something breathing against the walls of the cabin, all of it stopped in a sequence that felt deliberate, like someone turning off machines one at a time. The silence that replaced it was not relief. It was a held breath. The forest was waiting. Geronimo opened the door at 6:30. The clearing looked exactly as we had left it. Our vehicles were still parked in a row near the gravel road. The fire pit still held the gray remains of the previous night as fire. The other cabins stood empty and undamaged. Everything appeared normal, and that appearance was the worst part, because it meant that whatever had spent the night circling our walls and wearing our faces had left no evidence of itself behind. Except one thing. In the dirt beside the front steps of the cabin, there were footprints, bare human feet, except each one had only 4 toes. The prints circled the cabin in the same pattern as the footsteps we had heard, and at each window they stopped and turned inward, indicating something that had stood and looked and studied us while we cowered inside. We packed in silence. Geronimo moved with military efficiency, breaking down camp with gestures and nods rather than words. No one wanted to speak. Speaking felt dangerous now, as if our voices might attract something, or worse, might be overheard and catalogued and replayed back to us from a mouth that was not ours. Cochise loaded the vehicles while Mangus Coloradas and Ju swept the cabins for anything left behind. Victorio sat in the back seat of Geronimo's truck and did not move. Chato helped with the gear, but his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped everything he touched. Lozan walked the perimeter of the clearing once, slowly, looking at the ground, reading signs that the rest of us could not interpret. Lozan came back and said, "It is still here. It did not leave when the sun came up. It moved back into the trees, but it did not leave. It is watching us right now. I can feel it the same way you feel someone standing behind you in a room. It is close, and it is patient." Goyakla said something then that I will carry with me until I die. He said, "It learned all of our voices. It learned all of our faces. It does not need to follow us. It knows us now. It can find us whenever it wants. Wherever we go, it knows how to become us. And the people in our lives, our families, our friends, our co-workers, they will not be able to tell the difference. Not at first. Not until it is too late." We drove out in convoy, 3 vehicles on that narrow gravel road, moving through the trees in a line that felt less like a departure and more like a retreat. I was in the middle vehicle with Nana and Lozan. None of us spoke for the first 20 minutes. The forest pressed in from both sides, the canopy overhead creating a tunnel effect that made the road feel like a throat, and I could not shake the feeling that we were being swallowed rather than released. As we reached the paved road and turned south toward town, Nana finally spoke. He said something about the incident 40 years ago, the one he had refused to discuss the night before. He said the people he lost were not killed. They were replaced. They came back from the woods looking like themselves, talking like themselves, acting like themselves. But something behind their eyes was different. Something fundamental had been exchanged. He said he noticed it in small ways at first, a word used incorrectly, a memory that did not match, a laugh that came half a second too late, as if the thing wearing his friend's face was processing the joke and calculating the appropriate response rather than simply reacting. He said he left and never went back, and the people he had known before that trip were never the same. Naish was reported missing 3 days later. Search and rescue teams spent 2 weeks combing the mountains around Harper's Ferry. They found his water bottle near the creek. They found one of his socks near the ridge trail to the east. They did not find Naish. We do not talk about the trip anymore, not as a group. Geronimo called me once, about 6 months later, and asked me if I had noticed anything strange about Chato. I asked what he meant. He said Chato had called him the week before, and they had talked for an hour, and the conversation was normal, completely normal, except for one thing. Chato had laughed at a joke Geronimo told, and the laugh came half a second too late. Half a second. Such a small thing. Such a tiny, meaningless delay. But Geronimo heard it, and he recognized it, and he hung up the phone and sat in his kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall, trying to decide whether the person he had been talking to was still Chato. I do not know the answer to that question. I do not know if any of us are still entirely ourselves. I know that sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the air is still, I hear my own voice coming from a room I am not in, saying words I have never said, in a tone that is mine and not mine at the same time. I know that when I look in the mirror some mornings, the reflection looks back at me with a delay so small that I cannot be sure it is real. A fraction of a second where the eyes in the glass seem to be studying me rather than reflecting me. I know that Lozan has stopped answering phone calls. I know that Victorio moved to a different state and changed his number and told Geronimo not to contact him again. And I know that every summer, when the humidity rises and the forests of West Virginia grow thick and still and heavy with the weight of things that have been living in them for longer than anyone can remember, something walks through the hollows above Harper as fairy wearing faces that it collected from a group of 10 people who should never have gone into those woods. 10 faces, 10 voices, 10 sets of memories and mannerisms and habits that it studied and absorbed and carries with it now like trophies. If someone calls your name from the woods, do not answer. If someone who looks like your friend walks out of the trees, look at their feet before you look at their face. And if you ever find yourself counting toes and coming up short, run. Do not speak. Do not acknowledge what you have seen. Just run. And do not stop until the trees are behind you and the sun is on your face and you are surrounded by people whose eyes do not carry that terrible, patient, empty stillness that no living creature should ever possess. I wish I had never gone to Harper's Ferry. I wish Geronimo had never sent those photos. I wish Goyakla had never told us those stories by the fire. But wishes do not undo what has already been done. And whatever walked out of those woods wearing our faces is still out there, still patient, still waiting. I hear it sometimes, late at night, practicing my voice in the room next door, getting better, getting closer, getting ready for something I do not have the courage to imagine. If you are listening to this, do something for me. Like this video, share it with someone you trust. Because the more people who know what to look for, the harder it becomes for these things to hide, and they are hiding. In every forest, in every hollow, in every quiet stretch of wilderness where the animals have gone silent and the water has stopped moving and the air tastes like something old and wrong and endlessly, impossibly patient, they are already wearing someone's face. Make sure it is not yours. What I saw in the darkness of the forest, my story with the creature that hunted me to the edge of death. It was the summer of 1989 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. I had rented a cabin for the weekend, nestled deep in the heart of the forest with my 2 college buddies, Tommy and Rick. It was supposed to be an easy getaway from the grind. Just 3 friends, a cooler of beers, and a few nights by the fire. We hadn't seen each other since graduation, and this weekend was supposed to be our chance to catch up, relax, and relive old memories. Nothing about it was meant to be dramatic, let alone terrifying. The drive up was longer than expected. Greenbrier's winding roads snaked through the dense woods, where the trees grew thick and tall, casting long shadows that covered the entire road in a greenish-black haze. The town itself was quaint, a small collection of homes, a single diner, and a gas station. It felt like a place frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. The locals were friendly but distant, their eyes lingering on us a little too long as we passed by. We stocked up on essentials and set out for the cabin. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The cabin was isolated, exactly as advertised, standing alone amidst towering trees, its weathered wood blending into the landscape. There was a lake nearby and a narrow dirt path led down to it, promising fishing, swimming, and maybe a little adventure. The place felt perfect for what we had in mind. No phones, no distractions, just the 3 of us and nature. The rental agent had left the key under a terracotta pot by the front door, just as promised in her letter. The cabin was larger than it appeared in the photographs I'd received. 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a living area dominated by a stone fireplace. Everything was clean but dated, like stepping into the early 1970s. Wood paneling covered the walls, and the furniture was solid but worn with use. "Home sweet home," Rick announced, dropping his duffel bag on the worn plaid couch. At 30, Rick still had the athletic build from his college football days, though his dark hair had started thinning at the temples. He'd been the first to agree to this trip, desperate for a break from his accounting job in Pittsburgh. Tommy whistled as he inspected the kitchen. "Check out this ancient stove. My grandmother had one just like it." Tall and lanky with perpetually disheveled blonde hair, Tommy was the most laid back of our trio. He'd been bouncing between jobs since graduation, never quite settling on a career path. I started unpacking the groceries we'd picked up in town, steaks for grilling, eggs and bacon for breakfast, and of course enough beer to last the weekend. The cabin's previous occupants had left a stack of firewood on the porch, which was fortunate since the temperature dropped considerably after sunset in these mountains, even in summer. As the daylight faded, we settled into an easy rhythm of conversation, catching up on the years that had passed since we'd last been together. Tommy had recently broken up with his girlfriend of 3 years. Rick was considering proposing to his, and I was focused on advancing at the engineering firm where I'd been working since graduation. The first night went off without a hitch. We lit a fire, cooked steaks over an open flame, and let the beers flow. The conversation was easy, full of the kind of reminiscing that always happens when friends haven't seen each other in a while. We talked about old college days, girls we used to know, and the future that seemed wide open. "Remember Professor Hamill's final exam?" Tommy laughed, tipping his beer bottle toward me. "Dan here stayed up for 48 hours straight studying for that thing. And still only got a B-," I added, smiling at the memory. Rick tossed another log onto the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "Those were simpler times, man. No mortgages, no bosses breathing down your neck." But sometime after midnight, as the fire began to die down and the woods around us seemed to creep in, I heard something, a faint rustling in the distance, like the sound of dry leaves being kicked up. At first I dismissed it as a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the longer I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't just movement, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy enough to crunch the twigs underfoot. I glanced at Tommy and Rick, but they hadn't seemed to notice. They were deep in conversation, arguing about who could throw a football farther back in the day. Still, something about the sound set me on edge. I stood up casually and walked toward the edge of the clearing, my eyes scanning the tree line. The moonlight was dim, barely enough to see the outlines of the trees, but for a moment I thought I saw something move. A dark shape, too large to be an animal, slipped between the trees and disappeared into the shadows. My stomach tightened and I felt a wave of unease. "You good, Dan?" Tommy called out, noticing my absence from the circle. Yeah, just thought I heard something," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "Probably a bear or something," Rick said, not even bothering to look up from the fire. "We're in the middle of nowhere." I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I shrugged it off and sat back down. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It lingered like a cold breath on the back of my neck, making it hard to relax. I didn't mention it again, though, figuring it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. We turned in around 2 a.m., with Rick and Tommy sharing the larger bedroom while I took the smaller one. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin's old frame, every whisper of wind through the trees outside my window, kept me on edge. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were troubled. Dark forests, running, and always the sense of being pursued by something I couldn't quite see. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air. Morning brought clarity, and with it, a sense of foolishness for my night fears. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, transforming the ominous forest of the previous night into a picturesque woodland scene. The chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze replaced the eerie silence that had seemed so threatening in the darkness. Rick was already up when I emerged from my room, brewing coffee in the ancient percolator we'd found in the kitchen cabinet. "Sleep well?" he asked, pouring me a cup. "Not really," I admitted. "Place takes some getting used to." He nodded, understanding. "City boy," he teased. You forget what real quiet sounds like. Tommy joined us an hour later, his hair sticking up at odd angles, looking surprisingly well rested. We decided to spend the day exploring the area around the cabin, starting with the lake we'd glimpsed upon our arrival. The next day we spent most of our time down by the lake. The water was cool, refreshing, and the perfect antidote to the rising summer heat. We swam, fished, and goofed around. The lake was smaller than it had appeared from the cabin, perhaps a quarter-mile across, with crystal-clear water that reflected the surrounding forest like a mirror. Tommy had brought a disposable camera and took photos of Rick and me posing with the modest-sized bass we'd managed to catch. But every now and then I'd catch myself looking back toward the woods, half expecting to see that same dark shape lurking between the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Earth to Daniel. Tommy waved his hand in front of my face, pulling me from my thoughts. You keep staring off into the trees like you're expecting Bigfoot to show up. I forced a laugh, just taking in the scenery. Right, Tommy said skeptically. You've been jumpy since we got here. What gives? I hesitated, not wanting to dampen the mood with my irrational concerns. It's nothing. Just thought I heard something weird last night. Rick looked up from baiting his hook. Like what? Footsteps, maybe. And I thought I saw someone watching us from the trees. Even as I said it, I felt foolish. Rick and Tommy exchanged glances. Probably just a local, Rick suggested with a shrug. People hunt in these woods, right? Could have been checking us out to make sure we weren't messing with their hunting spot. The explanation made sense, and I wanted to believe it. But something about the way that figure had moved, so deliberate, so purposeful, made me doubt it was just a curious local. As the day wore on, Tommy suggested we take a hike. There was a trail behind the cabin that supposedly led up to a ridge with a great view of the valley. It sounded like a good idea at the time, and I agreed, hoping the walk would help clear my head. We started up the trail around mid-afternoon. The woods were dense, almost unnaturally so, with thick underbrush and towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool, despite the summer heat, and the deeper we went, the quieter everything became. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The trail was poorly maintained, with fallen branches and overgrown sections that forced us to push through brambles and thickets. Several times we lost the path entirely and had to backtrack. What should have been a pleasant hike was quickly becoming an arduous trek. You sure this is the right way? Tommy asked, wiping sweat from his brow. That's what the map showed, I replied, though I was beginning to doubt it myself. We pressed on, climbing steadily upward. The forest grew denser, the trees closer together, their branches intertwining above us to block out the sky. The silence was oppressive, broken only by our labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig under our boots. About halfway up, Rick stopped suddenly. Did you hear that? This time I wasn't the only one. It was the same sound from the night before, footsteps, but now they were closer, unmistakable, and moving toward us. The three of us stood still, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time faster, almost like someone was running. I scanned the woods, my heart pounding, but I couldn't see anything through the thick trees. I think we should head back, Tommy muttered, his voice low, all traces of humor gone. We turned around, trying to walk casually but quickening our pace. The footsteps continued, always just out of sight, but matching our speed. I glanced back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw him. A man, or at least what I thought was a man, standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden by the shadows. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. I felt a surge of panic and broke into a run. Tommy and Rick followed suit, and we tore down the trail as fast as we could, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind us. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran, and more than once one of us stumbled on the uneven ground. I could hear Rick's ragged breathing close behind me, and Tommy's panicked footfalls just ahead. The sound behind us never faltered. Steady, relentless, gaining. He's getting closer, Rick gasped, risking a glance over his shoulder. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Fear had taken hold completely, driving me forward with a primal urgency I'd never experienced before. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but stopping wasn't an option. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I could see the cabin ahead, its weathered wood a welcome sight. We burst from the forest and sprinted across the clearing, not slowing until we reached the safety of the porch. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin, breathless and sweating. "What the hell was that?" Rick panted, his face pale. "I don't know," I said, trying to catch my breath. "But he was following us. Did you see him?" Tommy nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, we need to get out of here." But leaving wasn't an option. The sun was already setting and the nearest town was miles away. Driving those dark, winding roads at night wasn't exactly appealing, especially not after what had just happened. We decided to stay put, lock the doors, and ride it out until morning. As dusk settled over the cabin, we moved with a sense of urgency, checking locks, drawing curtains, and gathering anything that might serve as a weapon. Rick dragged a heavy dresser in front of the back door, while Tommy went from room to room, making sure every window was securely latched. "We should call the police," Tommy suggested, his voice tight with anxiety. I shook my head grimly. "No phone, remember? That was part of the rustic charm the rental agent promised." Rick ran a hand through his hair, his expression grim. "So we're on our own." The realization hung heavy in the air between us. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, we had no way to call for help. Our only option was to wait out the night and leave at first light. "Look," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We don't know that this guy means us any harm. Maybe he's just some local weirdo who gets his kicks scaring tourists." "You didn't see his face," Tommy countered, pacing nervously. "There was something wrong about him." As darkness fell completely, we huddled in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth providing our only source of comfort. I'd retrieved my rifle from the car, a Winchester Model 70 I'd brought along in case we spotted any game, and kept it close at hand. None of us had much appetite, but we forced down some sandwiches, knowing we needed to keep our strength up. "Tell me again what you saw last night," Rick asked, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I recounted the footsteps, the shadowy figure moving between the trees, the overwhelming sense of being watched. Tommy nodded in agreement, adding details from our encounter on the trail: the man's height, his dark clothing, the hood that obscured his face. "Did either of you get a look at his face?" Rick pressed. We both shook our heads. "It was too dark," I explained. And he kept his distance like he was, studying us. The word choice sent a chill through the room. We fell silent, each lost in our own thoughts, jumping at every creak of the cabin's wooden frame, every whisper of wind outside. As the hours passed, a strange calm settled over me. The initial panic had given way to a hyper-vigilant alertness. I found myself listening intently to the sounds of the forest, trying to distinguish between the natural noises of the night and anything that might signal the presence of our stalker. Rick dozed fitfully on the couch, while Tommy kept watch by the window, occasionally pulling back the curtain to peer into the darkness. I checked my watch, just past 11 p.m. The night stretched ahead of us, long and uncertain. "Maybe we should take shifts," I suggested. "Two sleep, one stays awake." Tommy nodded, grateful for the structure. "I'll take first watch." "Wake me in 2 hours," I said, settling into an armchair, the rifle across my lap. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure watching from the trees. Instead, I found myself thinking about the locals we'd encountered in town, their wary glances, their reluctance to engage in conversation. Had they known something? Had there been warnings we'd missed? I was still awake when the first sounds came, just before midnight. A soft crunch of leaves outside, then silence. Tommy tensed by the window, his eyes meeting mine across the room. Rick stirred, but didn't wake. "Something's out there," Tommy whispered, barely audible. I nodded, rising slowly from the chair, careful not to make any sudden movements. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight as I moved to join Tommy at the window. Together we peered through a small gap in the curtains, our breath fogging the glass. At first I saw nothing but darkness. The moon had disappeared behind clouds, leaving the clearing in front of the cabin shrouded in shadow. Then a movement caught my eye, a darker patch against the night, moving slowly along the tree line. "There," I breathed, pointing. Tommy saw it too, his body going rigid beside me. The figure was more visible now, emerging from the forest with deliberate steps. It was him, the same tall, hooded man we'd seen on the trail. He stood at the edge of the clearing for what felt like an eternity, facing the cabin. Then, with slow, purposeful strides, He began walking toward us. "Wake, Rick," I hissed, raising the rifle to my shoulder. Tommy shook Rick roughly, clamping a hand over his mouth to stifle any noise. Rick's eyes flew open, confusion quickly giving way to understanding as Tommy gestured urgently toward the window. The three of us watched in horrified fascination as the figure approached, his movements unhurried, almost mechanical. He was tall, taller than I'd initially thought, well over 6 feet, and broad-shouldered beneath the dark clothing. The hood still concealed his face, casting it in impenetrable shadow. "What does he want?" Tommy whispered, his voice cracking. I had no answer. The man stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, standing perfectly still, facing the front door. The stillness was somehow more terrifying than if he'd charged at us or tried to break in. He was waiting, watching, hunting. For nearly an hour, he remained motionless, a dark sentinel in the night. We took turns watching him, afraid to look away for too long. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. "Is he gone?" Rick asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I'm not taking any chances." That night, the atmosphere inside the cabin was tense. We kept the fire going, the lights on, and sat close together, talking in low voices. Every now and then, one of us would glance at the window, half expecting to see that hooded figure standing outside, watching us. Around midnight, the knocking started. It was slow at first, almost gentle, like someone tapping on the window. We all froze, our eyes darting toward the sound. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and it wasn't just coming from one window, it was all around us. The front door, the back door, the windows in the living room. It was like someone was circling the cabin trying to get in. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered, his face ashen in the firelight. Rick grabbed a fire poker, its iron tip glowing faintly red from the heat of the hearth. Tommy armed himself with a kitchen knife, its serrated edge catching the light as his hand trembled. I gripped my rifle tighter, moving to the center of the room where I could pivot quickly to face any direction. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We can't stay here." Before anyone could respond, the front door rattled violently as if someone was trying to break it down. The sound echoed through the cabin, and for a moment we all just stared at it, paralyzed with fear. Then, without warning, the door burst open. He was standing there, the hooded figure taller and more imposing than I had realized. His face was still obscured, but I could see his hands, large, rough, and holding a crowbar. He stepped inside slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. "Get back," I shouted, raising the rifle, but he didn't stop. Time seemed to slow as I squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the confined space of the cabin, the flash momentarily blinding me. Through the gun smoke, I saw the figure stagger backward, a dark stain blooming on his chest. But he didn't go down. Instead, he straightened and continued his advance, the crowbar raised menacingly. I fired again, panic making my hands shake. The shot went wide, splintering the doorframe behind him. The figure kept coming, unfazed, his movements slow but deliberate. Tommy lunged at him with the knife, a desperate cry tearing from his throat. The blade connected, sinking into the man's shoulder, but he barely seemed to notice. With a casual swipe of the crowbar, he knocked Tommy aside, sending him crashing into the coffee table. Rick charged next, swinging the fire poker with all his strength. It connected with the figure's arm with a sickening thud, but it was like the man didn't even feel it. He turned toward Rick, his movements unnaturally fluid, and swung the crowbar in a wide arc. Rick ducked, but not quickly enough. The metal caught him on the shoulder, and I heard the distinct crack of bone breaking. Rick crumpled to the floor, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. I fired again, aiming for his chest, but he just kept coming. The bullet hit him square in the torso, and he staggered slightly, but didn't fall. It was impossible. No one could take a shot like that and remain standing. Fear gave way to a kind of desperate fury. Desperation took over. I grabbed a lamp and smashed it over his head. The glass shattered, but he barely flinched. He swung the crowbar at me and I ducked just in time, the metal crashing into the wall behind me. We were losing. I could feel it in my bones. This man, whoever or whatever he was, wasn't human. Not entirely, anyway. The cabin had become a battlefield, furniture overturned, glass shattered across the floor. Tommy was struggling to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Rick was still down, his face pale with shock, and the figure kept advancing, relentless, unstoppable. In the chaos, my gaze fell on the fireplace, where flames still licked at the logs we'd placed there hours before. Fire. It was a desperate plan, but it was all I had. I dove for the hearth, grabbing a burning log with my bare hands. The pain was immediate and searing, but adrenaline dulled it to a manageable roar. I whirled, the flaming wood held before me like a torch, and charged at the figure. The hood caught first, the fabric igniting with a whoosh of flame. The figure reeled backward, dropping the crowbar as his hands flew to his face. For the first time he made a sound, a guttural, inhuman howl that chilled my blood despite the heat of the fire. "The car!" Rick shouted, his voice strained with pain. "Get to the car!" Tommy was already moving, helping Rick to his feet. I backed toward them, keeping the burning log between me and the flaming figure, who was now thrashing wildly, trying to extinguish the fire that had engulfed his upper body. We bolted for the back door, leaving Tommy to fend him off for a few precious seconds. I could hear the struggle behind me, the sound of flesh hitting flesh, the grunts of pain, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. We made it to the car and piled in, the engine roaring to life just as the man appeared in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway watching us. Incredibly, despite the flames that had engulfed him moments before, he was barely singed. The hood was gone, revealing a face so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness, with eyes that reflected the car's taillights like those of an animal caught in headlights. But most disturbing was his expression, or rather the lack of one. There was no anger, no pain, just an empty, calculating stare. He didn't chase us. He didn't need to. The terror he left behind was more than enough. I gunned the engine, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. The car fishtailed wildly before straightening out on the narrow drive. Tommy was in the back seat with Rick, trying to stabilize his broken shoulder with shaking hands. "What the hell was that?" Tommy kept repeating, his voice rising hysterically with each iteration. "What the hell was that?" I had no answer. My mind couldn't process what we'd just experienced. No human could have withstood those gunshots, that fire. And yet, the figure had been solid enough, had bled when shot, had used physical tools like the crowbar. Whatever he was, he existed in our world, bound by at least some of its rules. The winding road back to town seemed longer than ever, each curve revealing only more darkness ahead. My burned hands throbbed painfully on the steering wheel, blisters already forming across my palms. In the rearview mirror, I could see Rick's face contorted in pain, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle. "We need to get Rick to a hospital," Tommy said, his voice steadier now that we were putting distance between ourselves and the cabin. "The sheriff's office first," I insisted. "We need to report what happened." No one argued. We all knew we needed help, professional help, to deal with whatever was back there. We drove straight to the police station, but when we returned with the sheriff, the cabin was empty. No sign of the man, no blood, nothing. It was like he had never been there. Sheriff Dawson was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd heard every conceivable lie over a long career. He surveyed the cabin's interior with narrowed eyes, taking in the overturned furniture, the shattered lamp, the splintered doorframe. "And you say this fella took 2 bullets to the chest and kept coming?" he asked, not bothering to hide his disbelief. 3, I corrected. "I hit him 3 times, and then we set him on fire." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Yet there's no blood, no burn marks." He gestured around the cabin. "Lot of damage, sure, but nothing that couldn't have been caused by 3 drunk city boys having themselves a time." "We weren't drunk," Tommy protested, though his voice lacked conviction. The scene did look different in the harsh light of morning, less like the site of a supernatural encounter and more like the aftermath of a wild party. "What about Rick's shoulder?" I demanded. "You think he broke that himself?" The sheriff shrugged. "Could have happened any number of ways. Fall down the stairs, tumble off the porch." He pocketed his notebook. "Look, boys, I'm not saying you didn't see something. These woods can play tricks on a man's mind, especially at night. Could have been a vagrant, maybe, though we don't get many of those around here." "It wasn't a vagrant," I insisted, "and it wasn't our imagination. This thing, this man, he was real and dangerous." Sheriff Dawson sighed, clearly tired of the conversation. "Tell you what, I'll keep an eye out. Ask around town if anyone's seen a stranger matching your description, but without evidence. He trailed off, his message clear. Without proof, there was nothing he could do. We left the cabin that morning, abandoning most of our belongings in our haste to be gone. Rick's shoulder required surgery. The break was complex, with bone fragments that needed to be pinned back together. The doctor at the small regional hospital asked how it happened, and we gave a sanitized version of events, claiming Rick had fallen down the cabin stairs in the dark. The doctor didn't believe us. That much was clear from his expression, but he didn't press the issue. Tommy and I spent a tense night in a motel on the outskirts of town while Rick recovered in the hospital. Neither of us slept much, jumping at every sound from the parking lot outside our window. We spoke little, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. The sheriff didn't believe us, of course. He chalked it up to too much alcohol and too much imagination. But we knew what we saw, we knew what had happened. "We should talk about it," Tommy said finally as dawn broke on what would be our last day in Greenbrier County. "About what we think it was." I nodded, grateful for the opening. "It wasn't human. Not entirely. But it bled," Tommy pointed out. "When you shot it, when I stabbed it, there was blood." "Yeah, but no body. No blood in the cabin when we went back." I ran a hand through my hair, frustration mounting. None of this makes sense. We fell silent again, the weight of the unanswerable pressing down on us. Finally, Tommy spoke, his voice hesitant. "You know, when we first got to town, I overheard something at the gas station. The attendant was talking to a local, mentioned something about the mill accident and how those woods haven't been right since." I looked up sharply. "What mill accident?" Tommy shrugged. "I don't know. They stopped talking when they noticed me listening, but maybe there's something to it," I finished. "Maybe there's a reason that thing is out there." With Rick still hospitalized, Tommy and I decided to do some digging. The town's small library was housed in an old Victorian building just off the main street. The elderly librarian regarded us with the same wary expression we'd encountered since arriving, but directed us to the local history section when we asked about the area's past. It didn't take long to find what we were looking for. A bound collection of local newspaper articles chronicled the town's history, including a major industrial accident in 1962. The Greenbrier lumber mill, located deep in the forest not far from where our cabin stood, had been the town's main employer until a catastrophic equipment failure caused a massive fire. 17 workers died, their bodies burned beyond recognition. The mill was never rebuilt, and the town had been in slow decline ever since. But it was a small sidebar article, dated 6 months after the accident, that truly chilled my blood. "Mill foreman's body still missing," the headline read. According to the article, the remains of Harold Blackwood, the mill's foreman who had been widely blamed for the safety failures that led to the disaster, had never been recovered. Local rumor held that Blackwood had fled into the forest rather than face the consequences of his negligence, choosing to live as a hermit rather than confront the families of those who had died under his watch. "This has to be it," Tommy whispered, tapping the yellowed page. "This Blackwood character. What if he never left? What if he's still out there, driven mad by guilt or isolation?" It was a rational explanation, more plausible than anything supernatural. A recluse living in the woods, perhaps deformed by burns suffered in the fire, targeting visitors who ventured too close to his domain. It made a certain kind of sense, and yet, that would make him what, 70, 80 years old? I countered. The man we saw was strong, fast, and no 80-year-old survives multiple gunshot wounds and being set on fire. Tommy had no answer for that. We left the library with more questions than answers, but at least we had a name, a history, something concrete to attach to our experience. We collected Rick from the hospital that afternoon, his arm in a cast and sling, his face pale but resolute. As we prepared to leave town, I felt a compulsion to drive past the cabin one last time, a need for closure perhaps, or simply to reassure myself that it had all been real. The cabin looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, showing no outward signs of the violence that had occurred within its walls. As we drove slowly past, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line watching our car. It was too distant to make out clearly, but I knew with certainty who it was. "He's still there," I said quietly, not wanting to alarm Rick, who was dozing in the back seat. Tommy followed my gaze and swallowed hard. Let's get out of here. I pressed the accelerator, eager to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and Greenbrier County. As we rounded the bend in the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror for one last look. The figure was gone, melted back into the forest that had harbored him for so long. I haven't been back to Greenbrier County since. None of us have. Rick's shoulder healed eventually, though he never regained full mobility in that arm. Tommy moved to California the following year, putting an entire continent between himself and those West Virginia woods. We still talk occasionally, but we never discuss what happened that weekend. Some experiences are too disturbing to revisit, even in conversation. But sometimes in my dreams I'm back in those woods. I hear those slow, deliberate footsteps behind me, drawing closer with each passing moment. I feel that same primal fear, that certainty that what pursues me is something beyond normal human understanding. And I wake, gasping for breath, grateful for the familiar surroundings of my bedroom, the reassuring sounds of the city outside my window. Was Harold Blackwood a man driven to madness by guilt and isolation? A vengeful spirit unable to rest after a tragic death? Or something else entirely, something that had always existed in those ancient forests, merely taking the form of a local tragedy? I'll never know for certain. But of one thing I am sure, there are places in this world where the boundary between the natural and the unnatural grows thin, where ancient, primordial forces still hold sway. Greenbrier County is such a place. And somewhere in those dense, shadowed woods, a tall figure in a dark hood still walks, waiting for unwary travelers to cross his path, waiting, watching, hunting. It's 1987 and I'm in the Ozark Mountains just outside of Fayetteville, Arkansas. I remember the air being sticky with the humidity of late August. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months, a weekend in a remote cabin with my two closest friends, Mark and Jerry. We hadn't seen each other much since high school, and now that we were all in our 30s, life had thrown us in different directions. I thought this was exactly what we needed to reconnect. No phones, no distractions, just us in the wilderness. The 3-hour drive from Little Rock had been filled with the kind of easy conversation that only comes with decades of friendship. Mark, always the successful one, spent most of the trip talking about his recent promotion at the investment firm. His voice carried that familiar confidence I'd known since we were kids playing baseball in his backyard. Jerry was quieter, occasionally mentioning his 2 kids or his recent divorce, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape as we wound deeper into the mountains. And me? I was just happy to be away from the monotony of my job at the newspaper, where the most exciting story I'd covered in months was a local bake sale. As our car climbed the narrow dirt road that supposedly led to our destination, the dense forest seemed to press in from all sides. Tall pines and ancient oaks created a natural tunnel, branches occasionally scraping against the roof of Mark's Jeep Cherokee. I checked the hand-drawn map for the 5th time. "Are you sure this is right?" Jerry asked, voicing the doubt that had been growing in all of us for the last 20 minutes. Mark's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Dave from accounting swore this place was perfect. Remote, quiet, great fishing nearby. I didn't mention that remote seemed to be an understatement. We hadn't passed another vehicle or building for at least 40 minutes. When we finally reached a small clearing, the cabin came into view, and my heart sank a little. The sight was underwhelming to say the least. It looked like no one had stepped foot inside for years. The structure was a single-story affair, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a dull gray. A sagging porch wrapped around the front, littered with dead leaves and what appeared to be animal droppings. Several windows were cracked, one patched with duct tape in a haphazard X pattern. "Well," Mark said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice, "this is rustic." Jerry let out a low whistle. "Man, your coworker must really hate you." We unloaded the Jeep in silence, each of us likely contemplating the long weekend ahead in this dilapidated shelter. The wooden porch creaked dangerously under our weight, and the front door squeaked open with the sort of groan you'd expect in a horror movie. Inside wasn't much better. A layer of dust covered every surface, and the air was stale and musty. The main room contained a small kitchenette, a worn couch, and a stone fireplace. 3 doors led off to what I assumed were bedrooms. "Dibs on whichever room has the least amount of spiders," Jerry called, peering cautiously into one of the bedrooms. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor and tried to muster some optimism. It's not that bad. We just need to air it out, clean up a bit. Mark was already inspecting the fireplace. At least this works. And hey, we brought enough beer to make anywhere feel like home, right? He was right about that. We'd packed as if preparing for an apocalypse where only alcohol would be accepted as currency. Within an hour, we'd swept the worst of the dust away, opened all the windows to let in fresh air, and set up a makeshift fire pit outside using stones we found scattered around the property. Mark hauled in firewood from a half-collapsed shed behind the cabin while Jerry and I unpacked the coolers of food and beer. By late afternoon, things were looking up. We'd claimed our respective bedrooms, each with a narrow bed and a nightstand that had seen better days, and arranged the lawn chairs around the fire pit. The cabin was situated on a small ridge, offering a view of the valley below and the endless expanse of forest. Despite the rundown state of our accommodation, there was something undeniably beautiful about the location. "You know what?" Jerry said, cracking open his first beer as we stood admiring the view. "This might not be so bad after all." As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the clearing, we fired up the portable grill we'd brought and threw on some steaks. The familiar routine of cooking and drinking eased the initial disappointment of the cabin's condition. By the time darkness fell, we were settled around the fire pit, flames casting a warm glow on our faces, reminiscing about high school antics and catching up on the past decade of our lives. Mark's booming laugh echoed through the trees as Jerry recounted the disaster that was his brother's wedding last spring. I swear the cake was sliding sideways like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The photographer was diving to catch it in the pictures before the whole thing came down. I felt the tension of the past few months melting away, replaced by the comfortable camaraderie we'd shared since we were teenagers. This was what I'd needed: simple connection, away from deadlines and responsibilities. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that first evening, we'd already gone through half a case of beer. The fire crackled, sending embers swirling into the darkening sky. The conversation flowed from Mark's recent promotion to Jerry's kids starting school, to my stagnant career at the Arkansas Gazette. The sound of the forest crept in around us, a symphony of crickets, frogs, and the occasional rustling in the bushes. It felt peaceful, serene even. Then came the howling. At first it was distant, just a faint wail carried on the wind. We all froze mid-conversation, bottles halfway to our lips, and looked at each other. After a moment of silence, Mark chuckled. "Coyotes," he said with the confidence of someone who'd grown up hunting with his father. "They sound closer than they actually are." Jerry nodded, though his eyes darted toward the dark line of trees surrounding our clearing. "Yeah, plenty of wildlife out here." I took another swig of beer, trying to ignore the slight tremor in my hand. The Ozarks had plenty of wildlife: coyotes, wolves, maybe even a bobcat. Nothing to worry about. But as the howling continued, it became harder to brush off. It wasn't just one animal. It was multiple voices, growing louder, as if they were getting closer. There was a rhythm to it, almost deliberate, unlike the sporadic yips and howls I'd heard from coyotes before. Mark stood up and stretched, his silhouette tall against the fire. "Probably just a pack hunting," he said, his tone more confident than his expression in the flickering light. "They've caught the scent of something." Jerry chuckled nervously, crushing his empty beer can. "Yeah, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." I wasn't so sure. There was something off about the howls, something more guttural than what I'd heard from any coyote before. They were deeper, a low rumbling tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I didn't say anything. We were 3 grown men after all. We weren't going to let a few animal noises ruin our weekend. As the howling faded into the distance, our conversation resumed, though with less enthusiasm. Mark kept glancing toward the tree line, and Jerry's jokes became more forced. I found myself straining to hear beyond the crackling of the fire, wondering if the howls would return. They didn't, at least not that night. But as we eventually doused the fire and retreated to the cabin, locking the door behind us with more care than was probably necessary, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness had announced its presence, something that was aware of us in a way that normal wildlife shouldn't be. "Well, gentlemen," Mark said, his voice deliberately light as he headed toward his bedroom, "try not to let Bigfoot get you in your sleep." Jerry forced a laugh. "If anything comes through that window, it's getting a face full of Jerry Daniels' famous morning breath." I smiled at their jokes but found myself checking the lock on my bedroom window before crawling into bed. The mattress was lumpy and the sheets smelled faintly of mothballs, but exhaustion from the drive and the beers soon pulled me toward sleep. Just before drifting off, I thought I heard it again, a single distant howl, echoing through the mountains, different from before, almost mournful. Sleep came in fitful waves, disturbed by the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin. The old structure seemed to breathe with the night wind, wooden beams creaking and settling. Through the cracked window, the symphony of night insects created a constant backdrop that rose and fell in intensity. Under different circumstances, it might have been soothing. I drifted in and out of consciousness, strange dreams mixing with half-heard sounds. In one dream, I was running through endless trees, something massive crashing through the underbrush behind me. In another, I stood frozen in a clearing as yellow eyes watched from every direction. Around 3 a.m., I woke fully, heart pounding from a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. As I lay there, trying to calm my breathing, I heard movement outside my window. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals or wind through the trees. This was heavier, more deliberate, rhythmic, almost. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen, my heart resuming its frantic pace. There it was again, a crunch of leaves followed by a scraping sound like claws on wood. Something was moving along the side of the cabin, close to my window. Slowly I eased out of bed, wincing as the ancient frame creaked in protest. The floorboards were cold beneath my bare feet as I crept to the window. The glass was cloudy with age and grime, but through a clearer section, I could make out the dark silhouettes of trees against the moonlit sky. Nothing else moved in my limited field of vision. The scraping came again, this time from the corner of the cabin. Whatever it was moving around the structure, testing it. I stood frozen at the window, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. Eventually the sounds faded, and the night returned to its normal cacophony of insects and distant animal calls. I returned to bed but didn't sleep again, my mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. By the time pale dawn light filtered through the window, I had convinced myself it was probably just a raccoon or possum investigating our food supplies. The smell of coffee drew me to the kitchenette, where Mark was already up, looking surprisingly chipper as he rummaged through our supplies. "Morning, sleeping beauty," he grinned, pouring me a cup of what looked and smelled like tar. "Hope you like it strong." I accepted the mug gratefully, the bitter liquid burning away some of the fog of my restless night. "Where's Jerry?" "Still out cold. Guy always could sleep through an earthquake." I leaned against the counter, cradling the warm mug. "Did you hear anything last night? Around 3, maybe?" Mark paused, his expression shifting slightly. "Like what?" "I don't know. Something moving around outside my window, scratching noises." He shrugged, but I could tell he was making an effort to seem unconcerned. "Probably just a raccoon. Plenty of them around here." Before I could press further, Jerry emerged from his room, hair sticking up at odd angles, eyes still puffy with sleep. "Please tell me that's coffee I smell." Mark handed him a mug, and we moved to the small table by the window. Through the grimy glass, the forest looked almost benign in the morning light, mist rising between the trees like spirits dissolving in the sun. Over a breakfast of bacon and instant oatmeal, I brought up the noises again. "Neither of you heard anything strange last night, around 3? Jerry shook his head, mouth full of bacon. "Slept like the dead." Mark hesitated, then set down his coffee. "I didn't hear what you're talking about, but when I went out for more firewood this morning, I noticed something weird." My stomach tightened. "What?" "Tracks, near the fire pit. Big ones." Jerry snorted. "What, like Sasquatch big?" Mark didn't smile. "No, like, I don't know what. Too big for a coyote, that's for sure. Not a bear either, I've seen bear tracks." "These were," he trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "What?" I pressed. He shook his head. "Different. I don't know. Maybe a mountain lion." Jerry laughed, but it sounded forced. "Great. So we've got the king of the jungle prowling around. Good thing we've got the big bad shotgun, right, Marky?" Mark had indeed brought his Remington 870, more out of habit than any actual concern for safety. It was currently propped in the corner by the door, looking simultaneously reassuring and ominous. "Mountain lions don't hunt humans," Mark said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Anyway, we've got plans today. That fishing spot Dave told me about is supposed to be about a mile from here." I didn't point out that none of us had mentioned the strange howling from the previous evening. Some things were easier to dismiss in the harsh light of day. We spent the morning hiking to the stream Mark's coworker had recommended. The path wound through dense forest, occasionally opening into small clearings filled with wildflowers and buzzing insects. Under different circumstances, I would have found it beautiful. Instead, I found myself constantly scanning the trees, jumping at every snapped twig or rustled leaf. The stream, when we finally reached it, was a disappointment, barely more than a trickle after the dry summer, with no sign of the promised trout. We made the best of it, settling on its banks with our fishing gear and another cooler of beer, but the earlier camaraderie felt strained. Jerry kept looking over his shoulder at the woods behind us, and Mark's usual stream of stories and jokes was notably absent. "So," Jerry said after an hour of fruitless fishing, "anyone want to address the elephant in the room?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "What elephant?" "Those howls last night, that wasn't normal coyote stuff." I felt a rush of relief that someone else had noticed. I thought the same thing. Mark reeled in his empty line with more force than necessary. "It was just animals. What else would it be?" Jerry shrugged. "I don't know, man, but it sounded off." "Look," Mark said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when closing deals at work. "There's nothing in these woods that we need to worry about. No wolves, no bears that would come near humans. We're fine." I wanted to believe him, but the memory of those deep, rumbling howls and the scratching outside my window lingered. "What about the tracks you found?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Could have been anything. A stray dog, maybe even a wolf, though they're not supposed to be in this area anymore." We fell into an uncomfortable silence, the gurgling of the pathetic stream the only sound besides the constant buzz of insects. After another hour with no bites, we packed up and headed back to the cabin. The hike back seemed longer, the forest darker despite the afternoon sun still filtering through the canopy. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, eyes following our progress from the dense undergrowth. Once, I thought I saw movement, something large and dark slipping between distant trees, but when I stopped to look, there was nothing. "You okay?" Mark asked, noticing my hesitation. "Yeah," I lied. "Just thought I saw something." By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the clearing. We busied ourselves with menial tasks, chopping more firewood, cleaning the grill for dinner, organizing our supplies. Normal activities that felt like we were constructing a facade of normalcy over something increasingly abnormal. As dusk approached, Jerry suggested we eat inside rather than around the fire pit. No one objected. We cooked hamburgers on the small propane stove in the kitchenette, the sizzling meat filling the cabin with a comforting aroma that temporarily masked the underlying mustiness. "So," Jerry said as we sat around the wobbly table, "how about we break out the cards? I think I saw a deck in that drawer." Mark nodded too quickly. "Good idea. Poker? 5-card draw?" We played for an hour, betting with matchsticks, forcing conversation about safe topic sports teams, mutual acquaintances from high school, Jerry's kids' latest achievements. The normalcy was almost convincing, until the howling returned. It started just as the last light faded from the sky, a single, mournful wail that seemed to come from the ridge above the cabin. We all froze, cards suspended in midair, eyes meeting across the table. Then another howl joined the first, and another, until the air was filled with a chorus of wailing that made my skin crawl. Jerry was the first to say what we were all thinking. "That doesn't sound like coyotes." We all fell silent, listening as the howls grew into a chorus of wails and screams echoing through the trees. My mind raced. Coyotes didn't sound like this. It was more human somehow, like a chant or a ritualistic call. There was an intelligence to it, a deliberateness that no wild animal should possess. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I think we should check the doors and windows." No one disagreed. We moved through the cabin mechanically, ensuring every entry point was secured. Mark retrieved the shotgun from the corner, checking it with practiced hands before setting it on the table. None of us mentioned how our gazes kept returning to it, like a talisman against the unknown. The howling continued, rising and falling in intensity. Sometimes it seemed to come from the ridge above, sometimes from the forest on either side of the cabin. It was impossible to pinpoint, as if the source was constantly moving, circling us. "It's surrounding us," Jerry whispered, his face pale in the dim light of the cabin's single lamp. "Don't be ridiculous," Mark snapped, but there was no conviction in his voice. "It's just echoing off the mountains." I stood by the window, peering out into the pitch-black woods, my heart pounding. The darkness beyond the glass was absolute, revealing nothing, yet I couldn't shake the certainty that something was out there, watching us, assessing us. As I stared into the void, a flash of movement caught my eye, something large darting between trees at the edge of the clearing. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me. "I think I saw something," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. Mark joined me at the window, squinting into the darkness. "Where?" "Near those big pines at the edge of the clearing. Something big." Jerry laughed, a high, nervous sound that held no humor. "Great. Just great." Mark's jaw worked silently for a moment. "It's probably just deer. They're active at night." But the howling didn't sound like any deer I'd ever heard. It continued for what felt like hours, sometimes fading into the distance only to return with renewed vigor, closer than before. We sat in tense silence, the abandoned card game forgotten, each lost in our own thoughts. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the howling stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against my eardrums like a physical force. For a moment we all stood frozen, unsure of what to do. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, feel the sweat on my palms. "Maybe they moved on," Jerry suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could respond, a heavy thud shook the north wall of the cabin. We all jumped, eyes darting to the source of the sound. Another thud followed, louder this time. The cabin walls shook slightly, and I saw Mark's hand move toward the shotgun. "What the hell was that?" Jerry whispered, rising slowly from his chair. Mark swallowed visibly. "Probably just a branch falling on the roof." But it hadn't come from the roof. It had come from the wall, as if something massive had thrown itself against the side of the cabin. Another impact, this time against the east wall, near my bedroom. The whole structure shuddered. A picture fell from the wall, its frame cracking on the wooden floor. "That's not a branch," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through me. Mark picked up the shotgun, his knuckles white around its wooden stock. "Get away from the windows," he ordered. We huddled in the center of the main room, backs to each other like survivors in a zombie film. The impacts continued, moving around the cabin in a deliberate pattern: north wall, east wall, south, west, then back to north, testing our defenses, looking for weakness. "We need to get out of here," Jerry said, his voice shaking. "Get to the car." Mark shook his head. "Whatever's out there is between us and the car. We're safer in here." I wasn't so sure, but the alternative of running blindly into the darkness where that thing was waiting seemed worse. Then came a new sound, scratching, like massive claws dragging slowly down the wooden walls. It moved from window to window, a deliberate display of power and patience. I imagined yellowed claws leaving deep gouges in the aged wood, and shuddered. "It knows we're here," I whispered. "It's toying with us." Mark shot me a warning look. "Don't anthropomorphize it. It's an animal, nothing more." But in my heart, I knew he was wrong. No normal animal behaved this way. No normal animal orchestrated a psychological assault designed to maximize fear. We stood there, frozen in indecision, as the scratching continued its methodical circuit of our shelter. Then, for the second time that night, everything went silent. The sudden absence of sound was almost worse than the scratching had been. "Do you think it's gone?" Jerry asked after a full minute of silence. As if in answer, something slammed into the front door with such force that the wood splintered around the hinges. We all jumped back, staring at the door as it buckled under the weight of whatever was outside. "Get back!" Mark shouted, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. I grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, my mind racing. The next impact hit the door even harder, sending splinters flying inward. Through the widening cracks, I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark, illuminated briefly by the moon as clouds parted overhead. The third impact tore the door from its hinges entirely. Time seemed to slow as the door collapsed inward, hitting the floor with a crash that reverberated through the cabin. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a musky, animal odor that made my nostrils flare. For a heartbeat, the doorway remained empty, a black void framed by splintered wood. Then it filled the space. Standing in the doorway was something I'll never forget. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with shaggy, matted fur covering its body. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, glowing a sickly yellow, and its mouth. God, its mouth was full of jagged teeth, too many teeth. Its hands were clawed, its legs bent like a dog's, but its posture was human. The creature stood perfectly still, as if taking our measure. Steam rose from its muzzle with each breath, visible in the cold night air. Those yellow eyes moved from Mark to Jerry to me, calculating, intelligent. Jesus Christ, Jerry whispered, backing away until he hit the wall. Mark's shotgun wavered slightly, then steadied. Get back, he shouted at the creature. Get the fuck back. The thing tilted its head, an eerily human gesture that sent chills down my spine. Then it let out a sound, not a howl this time, but a low rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air between us. Jerry panicked. He lunged for the bedroom doorway, perhaps thinking he could escape through a window. It was the worst thing he could have done. The sudden movement triggered the creature, which sprang forward with shocking speed. Jerry screamed, but it was cut short as the thing lunged forward, swiping at him with a clawed hand. The blow caught him across the chest, tearing through his shirt and the flesh beneath with horrifying ease. He went down in a heap, blood pooling beneath him on the wooden floor. Mark didn't hesitate. He fired the shotgun, the blast deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The creature jerked backward, black blood spattering from its shoulder, but it didn't fall. Instead, it turned toward Mark, yellow eyes narrowing, and charged. Mark managed to get off another shot, which caught the thing in the chest. Again, it staggered but didn't fall. Before Mark could pump the shotgun for a third shell, the creature slammed into him, sending him crashing into the wall with bone-crushing force. The shotgun clattered to the floor, sliding across the wooden planks to rest near my feet. I stood there, frozen, gripping the fire poker like a lifeline. The creature turned its gaze to me, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Those yellow eyes held mine, and I saw something there that turned my blood to ice recognition, not of me personally, but of what I was: human, prey, food. My brain screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if those eyes had paralyzed me, locking me in place as it decided how to end my life. It was Mark who saved me. Despite what must have been broken ribs or worse, he lunged forward from the floor, grabbing the creature's matted fur with both hands. With a strength born of desperation, he shoved the barrel of the shotgun, which he must have retrieved while I was transfixed, into the creature's mouth. "Eat this, you son of a bitch," he gasped, and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, and the creature let out a horrible gurgling noise as it staggered back, blood and gore spraying across the cabin. Part of its jaw was gone, black blood pouring from the wound, but incredibly, it was still standing, still moving. It turned its mutilated gaze back to me, and I knew it was now or never. I charged, swinging the fire poker with all my might. It connected with the creature's head with a sickening crunch, and it stumbled sideways, momentarily disoriented. The impact sent painful vibrations up my arms, but I didn't stop. I kept swinging, connecting with its head, its chest, anywhere I could reach. Black blood flew with each impact, spattering my face and arms, hot and viscous. The creature swiped at me, its movements slowing but still deadly. One claw caught my arm, tearing through my sleeve and into the flesh beneath. Pain exploded through my limb, but adrenaline kept me moving. I stumbled back out of reach, and my foot connected with something solid, the shotgun. In one fluid movement, I dropped the poker and grabbed the weapon, pumping it to chamber another shell. The creature lurched toward me, its ruined face a mask of primal rage. I fired. At such close range, the impact was devastating. The shot caught the creature square in the chest, and this time it went down. It crumpled to the floor, massive body twitching for a few moments before going still, yellow eyes dimming like lights being switched off. I stood there, panting, the shotgun still raised, my injured arm screaming in pain. The cabin was eerily silent now, the only sound my own ragged breathing and a soft, wet gurgle from the corner. "Mark." I rushed to his side, dropping to my knees beside him. He was alive, but barely. Blood soaked his shirt, spreading in a dark stain across his chest. His breathing was shallow, labored. "Hey," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did we get it?" "Yeah," I said, my own voice breaking. "We got it. It's dead." He nodded slightly, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Good. That's Good. I looked around desperately for something to stem the bleeding, but I knew in my heart it was too late. Whatever the creature had done to him when it slammed him into the wall had caused internal damage beyond any first aid I could provide. "Jerry?" he asked. I glanced toward where Jerry had fallen. There was no movement, no sound, just a dark, still form in a spreading pool of blood. "He's gone," I said softly. Mark closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were clouded with pain. "Listen, Will. You need to get out of here. Get to the car. Get help." "I'm not leaving you," I insisted, though we both knew there was no help close enough to matter. He gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me, you'll tell someone. What happened? What that thing was." "I promise," I said, though I had no idea how I would explain any of this to authorities. His grip loosened, his hand falling back to his chest. "Always knew. Camping was overrated," he whispered, and then he was gone, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, seeing nothing. I sat there for I don't know how long, numb with shock and grief. The cabin was silent except for the soft whisper of the wind through the broken doorway. Eventually, I forced myself to move, to think. First, I checked on Jerry, though I already knew what I would find. He was gone, his body torn open by the creature's claws, his face frozen in an expression of terror. I couldn't look for long. Then, reluctantly, I approached the creature's body. In death, it seemed somehow smaller, less monstrous. The matted fur was a mixture of gray and brown, caked with dirt and now its own black blood. The face, what remained of it after Mark's shotgun blast, was neither fully animal nor human, a nightmarish hybrid that defied classification. I studied its claws, its powerful limbs, the strange bend of its joints. This was no bear, no wolf, no known predator, yet it was real, solid, lying dead on the cabin floor. The Ozark Howler. I'd heard whispers of the legend growing up, a creature that roamed the mountains, something between a big cat and a wolf, with horns and glowing eyes. I'd always dismissed it as folklore, campfire stories to scare children. Now I knew better. My arm throbbed, reminding me of my own injury. The creature's claws had left 3 deep gashes from shoulder to elbow. I stumbled to the bathroom, found a first aid kit under the sink, and did my best to clean and bandage the wounds. They would need stitches, but that would have to wait. Outside, the night was silent. No howling, no animal sounds at all, as if everything in the forest was holding its breath. I considered my options. The Jeep was parked about 50 yards from the cabin, the keys still in Mark's pocket. I could try to reach it, drive down the mountain to find help. But the thought of stepping outside, of crossing that dark space with only the moon for light, made my heart race. What if there were more of them? In the end, survival instinct won out over fear. I retrieved the keys from Mark's body, reloaded the shotgun with the few remaining shells from his bag, and stood at the broken doorway, gathering my courage. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, the Jeep a dark silhouette against the tree line. Nothing moved in the silvery light. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside, shotgun raised, and began moving toward the vehicle, every sense straining for signs of danger. I was halfway there when I heard it, a single, distant howl, echoing from somewhere deep in the mountains. I froze, listening. Another howl answered the first, then another. Different voices, different creatures, a family group perhaps, or a pack. I ran the rest of the way to the Jeep, fumbling with the keys, nearly sobbing with relief when the engine roared to life. As I reversed and turned toward the narrow access road, my headlights swept across the cabin one last time. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree stall, upright eyes reflecting the light like a deer's. Then it was gone, and I was accelerating down the mountain, the cabin and its horrors receding in my rearview mirror. I don't remember much of the drive down the mountain. My mind was a fog of shock and pain, my injured arm throbbing in time with my heartbeat. I drove mechanically, guided more by instinct than conscious thought, the Jeep's headlights cutting a narrow path through the suffocating darkness of the forest. Several times I thought I saw movement in the trees alongside the row of dark shapes, keeping pace with the vehicle. But when I accelerated, heart in my throat, nothing pursued. Perhaps it was just my traumatized mind creating phantoms from shadows. I reached the main road after what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. The sight of asphalt, of human infrastructure, brought a rush of relief so intense I had to pull over, my hands shaking too badly to continue driving. I sat there, engine idling, as the first gray light of dawn crept into the sky. What was I going to tell people? Who would believe what had happened? I looked down at myself, clothes torn and stained with blood, some mine, some Mark's, some the black ichor from the creature. My story would sound like the ravings of a madman or a murderer. But I had promised Mark. I would tell someone what had happened, what that thing was. The nearest town was a small community called Huntsville, about 15 miles from where I'd reached the main road. I drove there slowly, the growing daylight revealing the full extent of my disheveled, bloodied state. The few early morning drivers I passed stared openly, some slowing to get a better look at the wild-eyed man in the blood-spattered Jeep. The Huntsville Sheriff's Office was a small brick building on the town's main street. I parked haphazardly in front and stumbled inside, the bell above the door announcing my arrival with incongruous cheerfulness. The deputy at the desk looked up, coffee mug halfway to his lips, and froze. "Jesus Christ," he said, standing quickly. "What happened to you, buddy?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain? My legs gave out suddenly and I crumpled to the floor, the room spinning around me. I woke in a hospital bed, the harsh fluorescent lighting assaulting my eyes. My arm had been properly bandaged, an IV drip inserted into my other arm. A nurse noticed I was awake and disappeared, returning moments later with a doctor and, to my surprise, 2 men in sheriff's uniforms. "Mr. McAllister," the doctor said, consulting a clipboard. "How are you feeling?" "Like hell," I croaked, my throat dry and raw. "My friends." "We know," one of the deputies interrupted. "We found the cabin, and your friends." His expression was grim, his eyes assessing me with undisguised suspicion. Of course they had. And what had they found there? 2 dead men and a... what? Had the creature's body still been there? Or had its pack come back for it, dragging it away into the forest, erasing the evidence of its existence? "Can you tell us what happened up there?" the second deputy asked. His voice was gentler but no less probing. So I told them. Not the whole truth, I wasn't that far gone, but a version of it. A large animal, possibly a bear, had attacked the cabin. It had killed Jerry instantly, mortally wounded Mark. I had managed to kill it with Mark's shotgun, but it had injured me in the process. "A bear," the first deputy repeated, clearly skeptical. "In August, attacking a cabin full of people." "It wasn't normal," I insisted. "It was. Wrong somehow, rabid maybe." The deputies exchanged glances. "And where is this bear now?" the second one asked. "I don't know. It was dead when I left, on the cabin floor." Another exchanged look. "Mr. McAllister, we found no animal remains at the scene." My blood went cold. "That's impossible. I shot it, multiple times. It was dead." "What we did find," the first deputy continued, ignoring my protest, "were 2 dead men, one with what looked like claw marks across his chest, the other with extensive internal injuries and a shotgun in his hands." He leaned closer. "We also found a considerable amount of alcohol." I understood then where this was going. "You think I'm lying?" "I think you've been through a traumatic experience," the second deputy said diplomatically. "Sometimes in situations like that our minds can fill in the blanks in ways that make sense to us." They thought I was delusional, or worse, that I had somehow been involved in my friends' deaths. I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it again. What was the point? Without the creature's body, without evidence, my story was just that, a story, a wild tale that no rational person would believe. "I need to rest," I said finally, turning my face away. They left eventually, but not before informing me that I would need to make a formal statement once I was discharged. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night in my mind. Had I imagined it? Was it possible that some kind of psychotic break had caused me to see a monster where there was only a bear or some other natural predator? No, I knew what I had seen. Those intelligent yellow eyes, that almost human posture, the deliberate way it had tested our defenses before attacking, that was no ordinary animal. I was discharged the next day, my arm stitched and bandaged, prescriptions for antibiotics and painkillers in my pocket. The deputies were waiting, as promised, to take my formal statement. I stuck to my bear story, though I could tell by their expressions that they didn't believe me. No charges were filed, there was no evidence of foul play beyond the strange circumstances, but I knew I was under suspicion. The official report listed the deaths as the result of an animal attack species undetermined. Mark's shotgun had indeed been fired multiple times, and both bodies showed wounds consistent with large predator attacks. But without the creature's body, without proof, the case remained open, the details murky. I attended the funerals the following week. Mark's was a large affair, his investment firm colleagues and extended family filling the church. Jerry's was smaller, more intimate, his ex-wife and 2 young children in the front row, their faces blank with shock and grief. I stood at the back for both services, unable to face the families, the questions that would inevitably come. What were his last words? Did he suffer? Questions I couldn't answer without revealing the full, unbelievable truth. In the months that followed, I tried to move on. I returned to my job at the newspaper, throwing myself into work, taking on extra assignments to keep my mind occupied. But the nightmares persisted, yellow eyes watching from the darkness, howls echoing through endless trees, Mark and Jerry dying over and over in new and horrible ways. I researched obsessively, spending hours in libraries, calling folklorists and wildlife experts, trying to find information on the Ozark Howler. Most dismissed it as legend, a campfire tale with no basis in reality. A few shared stories they'd heard sightings of a large, wolf-like creature with horns or unusual eyes, always in remote areas of the Ozarks. Nothing concrete, nothing that would validate what I had experienced. The closest I came to confirmation was a conversation with an elderly man in Fayetteville, a retired forest ranger who had worked in the Ozarks for over 40 years. I never saw it myself, he admitted, his weathered face serious. But I found things sometimes, tracks that didn't match any known animal. Carcasses of deer or cattle torn apart in ways no normal predator would. And once, just once, I heard it. The howling, I said, and he nodded. Like nothing on this earth, he said softly, made my blood run cold. I reported it, of course, but you know how bureaucracy is. They wrote it off as coyotes or wolves, even though wolves had been hunted out of the area decades before. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The old-timers, the folks who lived in those mountains for generations, they knew better than to go out at night during certain times of the year. They hung charms over their door-cedar branches and iron nails. Superstition, most would say. But those families survived when others didn't. I left his small house with a mix of validation and renewed fear. I wasn't crazy, I hadn't imagined it. But that meant it was real, and still out there, still hunting in those remote mountains. As fall turned to winter, my obsession began to affect my work. I missed deadlines, snapped at colleagues, spent work hours researching cryptozoology and Ozark folklore instead of covering local politics and community events. My editor called me into his office just before Christmas. "Will," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "we need to talk about what's going on with you." I knew what was coming, a reprimand, perhaps probation. I'd been a good reporter once, reliable if not particularly ambitious. Now I was a liability. "I know I've been distracted," I admitted. He sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "Distracted is putting it mildly. Look, everyone knows you went through something terrible this summer. Losing 2 friends like that," he shook his head, "it would affect anyone." I said nothing. What could I say? "I think you need help, Will. Professional help. There's no shame in it." "I'm fine," I said automatically. He gave me a long look. "You're not fine. You haven't been fine since you came back from those mountains." He pushed a business card across the desk. "This is a good man. A psychiatrist. He's helped other folks who've been through trauma." I took the card reluctantly. "Dr. Arthur Mercer, psychiatrist, specialized in PTSD and trauma recovery." "Take some time off," my editor continued. "The holidays are slow anyway. Come back after New Year's once you've had some sessions with Dr. Mercer." It wasn't a request, I realized. It was an ultimatum. Get help or get fired. I started seeing Dr. Mercer the following week. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a methodical approach that I appreciated. He didn't push, didn't force me to talk about that night until I was ready. When I finally did tell him, I gave him the bear story, the official version. He nodded thoughtfully. "And is that what you believe happened?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, is that what you believe attacked your friends, a bear?" I hesitated. "Does it matter?" "It matters to you," he said simply. "You're carrying something heavy, Mr. McAllister. something beyond the natural grief of losing friends to a tragic accident. I said nothing, but in our next session I told him the truth. About the howling, the tracks, the way the creature had systematically tested the cabin before attacking. About its intelligence, its yellow eyes, the almost human quality of its movements. About how no one had found its body, how no one believed me. I expected skepticism, perhaps even concern for my mental state. Instead, he listened attentively, his expression neutral. "Do you think I'm crazy?" I asked when I'd finished. "No," he said after a moment. "I think you experienced something traumatic, something that doesn't fit into your understanding of the world. Whether it was exactly as you remember or shaped by the extreme stress of the moment isn't for me to say. But you don't believe in the Ozark Howler." He smiled slightly. "What I believe isn't important. What matters is how this experience has affected you and how we can help you move forward." It wasn't the validation I'd hoped for, but it was something. Someone who would listen without judgment, who wouldn't immediately dismiss me as delusional or lying. Winter passed slowly. The nightmares continued, but with less frequency. Dr. Mercer taught me techniques to manage the anxiety, the hypervigilance that had become my constant companion. I returned to work, easing back into my routine, trying to rebuild the life that had been shattered that August night. But I never stopped looking for answers. I collected stories, eyewitness accounts of similar creatures seen throughout the Ozarks over the decades. I mapped sightings, looked for patterns. Most were clustered in remote areas, away from towns and highways. Many mentioned the distinctive howling, the yellow eyes, the unusual speed and strength. In late March, nearly 8 months after that night at the cabin, I received a letter. It was postmarked from Huntsville, the small town where I'd stumbled into the sheriff's office that dawn. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small plastic bag containing what looked like a tuft of coarse, matted fur. The note was brief, written in a shaky hand. "Mr. McAllister, I was one of the deputies who responded to the cabin that day. I'm retiring next month, moving to Florida, so I reckon it doesn't matter now if I share this with you." This was caught on a fence post about a quarter mile from the cabin. Game warden said it was probably just wolf or coyote, but I've been hunting these mountains for 40 years. Never seen fur like this on any animal I know. I believe you. Deputy Collins. I stared at the fur for a long time. It was a grayish-brown, coarser than any wolf or coyote fur I'd ever seen, with an odd, almost iridescent quality when it caught the light just right. I knew without testing it that it would match the creature I had killed that night. It wasn't much, just a tuft of fur and the word of a retiring deputy, not enough to convince the world, but it was enough for me, enough to know that I wasn't crazy, that what I had seen was real. The Ozark Howler was out there, hunting in those remote mountains. Perhaps it was the last of its kind, a relic from an earlier age that had somehow survived into the present. Or perhaps there were more, a small population hiding in the vast wilderness areas of the Ozarks, emerging only to hunt, to defend their territory. I keep the fur in a small box in my desk drawer. Sometimes, late at night when the memories are particularly vivid, I take it out and look at it, touch it, remind myself that it wasn't a dream or a delusion. It happened. It was real. I haven't returned to the Ozarks. I haven't gone camping or hiking since that night. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is quiet, I swear I can hear it, a distant, mournful howl that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows beyond the reach of rational understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, those things step into the light. It's been 5 years since that night in the Ozarks. 5 years since I watched my 2 closest friends die at the hands claws off something that shouldn't exist. The physical wounds have healed, leaving only a trio of ragged scars running down my left arm, a permanent reminder of what happened. The psychological wounds have been slower to mend. I left the Arkansas Gazette 2 years after the incident. My work had improved after the therapy sessions with Dr. Mercer, but something fundamental had changed in me. I no longer had the patience for city council meetings, for interviewing local business owners about economic development initiatives. Everything seemed trivial compared to what I knew was out there. Instead, I took a job with a small outdoor magazine based in Kansas City. The irony isn't lost on me, a man traumatized by an encounter in the wilderness, now writing about hiking trails and fishing spots. But it's given me the freedom and resources to continue my research, to visit remote areas across the country where similar creatures have been reported. I've been careful, methodical. I don't hike alone, don't stay overnight in isolated areas. I carry a more powerful weapon than Mark's shotgun had been, a .36 rifle with a scope, loaded with ammunition that would stop a grizzly. I've never had to use it, never seen another howler, but its weight on my shoulder is reassuring. In my research, patterns have emerged. The Ozark howler isn't unique to Arkansas. Similar creatures have been reported throughout the Appalachians, in remote parts of the Pacific Northwest, in the deep swamps of Louisiana. Different names, different descriptions in the details, but the core elements remain consistent: larger than wolves, yellow eyes, unusual howls, predatory intelligence that seems almost human. Cryptozoologists and folklorists dismiss these as regional variations of the same legend, cultural manifestations of our primal fear of the unknown wilderness, but I know better. I've corresponded with others who have encountered these creatures and survived, compared notes, compiled evidence. Not that I've gone public with any of this. I learned my lesson in those first confused days after the attack. Without a body, without irrefutable proof, such claims only damage one's credibility, one's standing in the community. I'm not interested in becoming another wild-eyed believer on a fringe documentary, pointed to as an example of how trauma can break a man's grip on reality. I keep my research private, my conclusions to myself. My articles for the magazine never hint at what I know. I write about the beauty of remote wilderness areas, the peace that can be found in nature, all while knowing that something ancient and dangerous watches from the shadows, hunting, waiting. Dr. Mercer and I still speak occasionally, though our formal sessions ended years ago. He's one of the few people who knows the full extent of my ongoing research, my private obsession. He doesn't judge, doesn't try to convince me that what I saw was a delusion or a misidentification. He simply listens and asks thoughtful questions that sometimes lead me to new avenues of investigation. "Have you considered," he asked during our last conversation, "that your focus on these creatures might be a way of maintaining a connection to Mark and Jerry, a way of giving meaning to their deaths?" I had considered it, of course. Had wondered if my inability to let go, to accept the official explanation and move on, was a form of complicated grief, a way of keeping my friends alive through this ongoing quest. Maybe, I admitted, but that doesn't make what I saw any less real. He nodded, conceding the point. "Just be careful that this search doesn't consume you, Will. There's still a life to be lived, even after something like this." He's right, I know. There have been other things in these 5 years' relationships that faltered because I couldn't fully explain my occasional nightmares, my reluctance to go camping, my private research that consumed too many evenings, a promotion at the magazine, recognition for my work, a small house on the outskirts of Kansas City, with a dog who greets me enthusiastically when I return from my research trips. Life continues, even after the impossible tears its way into your world. Last month I received an email that brought it all rushing back with fresh intensity. It came through the contact form on my professional website, where readers of my articles can reach out with questions about trails or fishing spots I've covered. "Mr. McAllister, you don't know me, but I read your article about hiking in the Ozarks. My husband and I are planning a trip to that area next month, staying at a remote cabin near Fayetteville. While researching the area, I came across an old news article about an animal attack in 1987 that mentioned your name. I know this is a long shot, but we've been hearing strange stories from locals about something called the Ozark Howler. Most treat it as a joke, but some seem genuinely afraid. I was wondering if you could tell me if there's any truth to these stories, or if we should be concerned about actual wildlife dangers in the area. Thank you for your time. Rebecca Daniels." I stared at the email for a long time, unsure how to respond. How do you tell a stranger that, yes, there is something in those mountains, something that killed your friends and nearly killed you? How do you warn them without sounding like a madman, without becoming the crazy local warning teenagers in a horror movie? In the end, I wrote back with practical advice about black bears and mountain lions, the standard wildlife precautions for hiking in the Ozarks. I suggested they stay in more developed areas rather than truly remote cabins, citing the better amenities rather than safety concerns. I didn't mention the howler, didn't share my experience. Would they have believed me if I had? But the email haunted me. More people going into those mountains, perhaps to the same areas where we had encountered the creature, more potential victims. The thought kept me awake at night, brought the nightmares back with fresh intensity. 2 weeks later, I requested time off from the magazine and drove back to Arkansas for the first time in 5 years. I told myself it was for an article, a retrospective on hiking trails in the state. My editor was delighted I'd avoided assignments in Arkansas for years, and he had always wondered why. I didn't go directly to the mountains. Instead, I spent several days in Fayetteville gathering information. The cabin where it had happened was no longer standing. It had burned down a year after our stay there, the fire attributed to lightning. No one had rebuilt on the site. I spoke with locals under the guise of researching regional folklore for a sidebar to my hiking article. Many had heard of the Ozark Howler, but most treated it as a joke, a story to scare tourists and children. A few, however, lowered their voices when they spoke of it, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. My grandfather used to say they've been in these mountains since before the Cherokee. An elderly woman at a local diner told me, her voice barely above a whisper, said they used to be men long ago, but something changed them, made them into something else. What changed them, I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the chill her words sent through me. She shrugged. Grandfather never said, just that they keep to themselves mostly, up in the deepest parts of the mountains, unless someone intrudes. Unless someone intrudes. The words echoed in my mind as I finally worked up the courage to drive to the area where the cabin had stood. The road was more overgrown now, barely passable even in my rented SUV. I parked where the dirt track became too rough to continue and hiked the rest of the way, my rifle slung over my shoulder, every sense alert for danger. The clearing was still there, though smaller now as the forest reclaimed the edges. No sign remained of the cabin, just a rectangular patch of slightly different vegetation where the foundation had been. Nature had erased nearly all evidence of what had happened here. I stood in the center of the clearing, memories washing over me, the fire pit we had built, the chairs where we had sat drinking beer that first evening, the sound of the door splintering as the creature broke through. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead, and for a moment I thought I heard it, that distinctive howl, distant but unmistakable. My heart raced, and I gripped the rifle tighter, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just the wind and my own fear playing tricks on me. I didn't stay long. There was nothing to find here, no answers to the questions that had driven me for 5 years. Whatever evidence might have existed was long gone, consumed by fire or reclaimed by the forest. As I hiked back to my vehicle, a movement caught my eye, something dark slipping between distant trees. I froze, raising the rifle instinctively, but it was gone before I could focus on it. A deer, perhaps, or a bear, or something else. I returned to Kansas City the next day, cutting my trip short. My editor was disappointed, but I promised to finish the article from home, using the material I'd already gathered. I didn't tell him about my visit to the clearing, about the shadow I might have seen in the trees. That night, I dreamed of the howler for the first time in months. Not the attack this time, but something different. I was standing in the clearing again, but I wasn't alone. The creature was there, watching me from the edge of the trees, its yellow eyes reflecting the moonlight. But it didn't attack, didn't approach. It simply watched, as if waiting for something. I woke in a cold sweat, the dream still vivid in my mind. Outside, the wind had picked up, branches scraping against the siding of my house in a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate. My dog lay at the foot of the bed, ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared at the bedroom window. I reached for the bedside lamp, but before I could switch it on, I heard it. A howl, distant but clear, cutting through the night like a knife. My dog whined, pressing against my leg, his eyes never leaving the window. Impossible, I thought. I was hundreds of miles from the Ozarks, in a suburban neighborhood outside Kansas City. It couldn't be here. But as I sat frozen in the darkness, the howl came again, closer this time, and then another answered it, from a different direction. They were moving, circling, just as they had that night at the cabin. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and pulled up the email from Rebecca Daniels. I had to warn her, had to try again to keep her and her husband away from those mountains. But as the screen illuminated, I saw I already had an email from her, sent just hours earlier. Mr. McAllister, I wanted to thank you for your advice about our trip. We've decided to stay in Fayetteville proper instead of the remote cabin we had originally booked. Something about your email made me reconsider the isolation, though I can't quite put my finger on why. Also, the strangest thing happened last night. We were driving back from dinner through a wooded area near our hotel, and we both could have sworn we heard the most unusual howling. Not like coyotes or wolves, something different. My husband said it was probably just the wind, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Anyway, thanks again for your help. Your articles have been invaluable in planning our trip. Best, Rebecca. I stared at the email, my blood running cold. They had heard it too. In Fayetteville, not up in the remote mountains, the howler was moving, expanding its territory perhaps. Or maybe it had always been more widespread than the isolated sightings suggested, hiding in plain sight, hunting in the shadows between civilization and wilderness. Outside, the howling had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I got up and checked the locks on the doors and windows, though I knew they would be little protection if the creature decided to come for me. My dog stayed close to my heels, still whining softly. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in my living room, rifle across my lap, watching the darkness beyond the windows, listening for any sound that didn't belong. By morning, I had convinced myself it was stress, imagination, the power of suggestion after my visit to the site of the attack. The howls had been coyotes, perhaps, or just the wind. But as I let my dog out into the backyard, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the soft earth of the flower bed beneath my bedroom window, was a single track. Large, canine in general shape, but too big for any dog, with strange elongated toe marks that ended in what looked like claw impressions. I stood staring at it, the morning sun warm on my back, while a cold certainty settled in my chest. It had found me. After 5 years, it had tracked me down. Not the same creature I had killed that one, but another of its kind. They were intelligent, I had always suspected that, but this suggested a level of reasoning, of purpose, that went beyond animal instinct. Revenge? Recognition? I couldn't be sure, but I knew now that my research, my quest for answers, had taken on a new urgency. This wasn't just about understanding what had happened that night in the Ozarks, about giving meaning to Mark and Jerry's deaths. It was about survival. The Ozark Howler, or whatever name it went by in different regions, was real. It was hunting, and for reasons I might never fully understand, it had me in its sights. I went back inside and sent a reply to Rebecca Daniels. Rebecca, I'm glad you decided to stay in town rather than in a remote cabin. About the howling you heard. Be careful. If you hear it again, especially if it seems to be getting closer, get indoors immediately. And perhaps consider cutting your trip short. I can't explain more right now, but please, take this seriously. Will McAllister. Then I opened my research files and began making calls. To the deputy who had sent me the tuft of fur. To others who had encountered similar creatures and lived to tell about it. To Dr. Mercer, who listened without judgment as I described the tracks outside my window, the howling in the night. What will you do? He asked when I had finished. I looked out at my backyard, at the single track that proved I wasn't crazy, that what I had experienced was real. In the daylight it seemed less threatening, just an impression in the dirt. But I knew what it meant. I knew what was coming. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I can't run forever, and I can't let anyone else go through what Mark and Jerry did, what I did. Be careful, Will, he said, concern evident in his voice. Whatever these creatures are, they're dangerous. Don't try to face them alone. But that's exactly what I might have to do, I thought as I hung up. Face them, confront them, find a way to prove their existence so that others would be warned, would be prepared. Tonight I'll sit in darkness again, rifle ready, listening for that distinctive howl, and tomorrow I'll continue my research, my preparation, because I know now that the story didn't end that night in the cabin. It's still unfolding, still echoing through my life like those howls through the mountains. The Ozark Howler is real. It's out there, and somehow, some way, I'll find the proof that everyone needs to see, before it's too late. My name is Samuel Whitaker, and in 1985 I rented a cabin in the Smoky Mountains with a group of friends for what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. There were 5 of us. Me, my college buddy Eric, his girlfriend Lisa, my younger brother Nathan, and Heather, a mutual friend who had tagged along at the last minute. We had all been busy with life, and this trip was meant to be a break, a chance to escape the grind, reconnect, and enjoy some time away from everything. The Smoky Mountains felt perfect for that. Quiet, isolated. We didn't expect anything to go wrong. Why would we? The cabin was old but charming in its own way, tucked deep into the woods. A 2-story log structure with creaky floorboards, thin walls, and a stone fireplace that gave the place a warm, rustic feel. We spent the first day hiking the trails nearby, cooking dinner over the fire and sharing stories while the cool night air settled in. Eric and Lisa sat close, whispering to each other, while Nathan and Heather argued over whether we should try night fishing the next evening. The peacefulness of the forest had us all relaxed, and by the time we settled into our rooms for the night, I was sure this would be one of those trips we'd talk about for years. The second night, though, was when things began to feel off. It was small at first, just strange sounds in the distance that none of us could place. We heard it while sitting around the fire laughing about some old college story Eric was retelling. A low rustling in the trees, the crack of twigs underfoot. But there were no animals or figures in sight when we turned our flashlights in the direction of the noise. Heather joked that it was probably a bear, but there was something unsettling about the way the sounds came and went so abruptly. Nathan shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the wind. The Smoky Mountains weren't exactly known for being quiet. But that night, after we'd all gone inside, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The kind of sound you know instinctively isn't an animal. I climbed out of bed and peeked through the small window near my bed, expecting to see one of the others outside, maybe grabbing firewood. But the moonlight cast shadows over an empty clearing. No movement. No one was there. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening for any more sounds. But after a while, everything went silent again. The next morning, I asked if anyone had been outside, but everyone denied it. They hadn't heard anything either. I didn't push it. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the dead of night. The real trouble started the following evening. We were sitting in the cabin's living room playing cards when the power went out. No warning, no storm, just an abrupt click, and everything went dark. "Did anyone check the generator?" Eric asked, getting up from his chair. Nathan grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, muttering about how we should have tested the damn thing when we first arrived. I followed him out, the beam of his light cutting through the thick woods as we made our way toward the small shed where the generator sat. The forest felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath, watching us. We found the generator fine, no damage, nothing that would explain why the power went out. Nathan flipped the switch a few times, but it didn't hum back to life. With no luck there, we decided to head back, thinking we could at least get the fire going again for some light. As we approached the cabin, something caught my eye. Movement by the tree line. I stopped, squinting into the growing darkness. A figure, someone standing just at the edge of the trees, watching us. "Nate," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Look." He followed my gaze and saw it too. A tall, gaunt figure half shrouded in the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human. "Hey," Nathan shouted, pointing his flashlight at the figure. But the moment the light hit them, they vanished into the trees, swift and silent. Too silent, not the kind of movement you expect from someone running through the underbrush. We sprinted back to the cabin, telling the others what we'd seen. Eric suggested we lock the doors and windows while Heather laughed nervously, clearly not taking us seriously. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever we had seen wasn't just some random hiker. The rest of the night was tense. We barricaded ourselves inside the cabin, listening for any more sounds, but none came. Still, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to those footsteps I'd heard the night before, the figure at the tree line. Something was wrong here. In the early hours of the morning, just as the first light began to creep over the horizon, there was a loud crash from the back of the cabin. It jolted everyone awake. We rushed downstairs to find the back door had been forced open. The wood around the lock splintered. Nathan grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and Eric picked up a heavy flashlight, his knuckles white around the handle. I armed myself with a knife from the kitchen, heart pounding in my chest. "Stay behind us," I told Lisa and Heather as we moved through the house, checking every room. Every shadow felt like it could be hiding something. Every creak of the floor made my stomach turn, but there was no one inside. Whoever or whatever had broken in was gone. For now. We gathered in the living room trying to figure out what to do next. Heather suggested we pack up and leave, but it was still early and the nearest town was a good hour's drive away. Plus, whoever had broken in was still out there, possibly watching us. Hours passed and we tried to keep calm, waiting for sunrise, thinking we'd be safe in the daylight. But as the sun climbed higher, the tension in the cabin grew unbearable. Every minute felt like a countdown. It wasn't until noon that the figure reappeared, this time closer. We saw him through the living room window, standing just a few yards from the front porch. Gaunt, with a hollow expression and sunken eyes, he stared at us with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. "What the hell does he want?" Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "He's not just watching anymore," Nathan said, his grip tightening on the fire poker. Eric moved toward the door, but I stopped him. "Wait, we don't know what he'll do." Then, without warning, the figure moved. Fast. He sprinted toward the front door, and before we could react, he was inside. Chaos erupted. Eric swung the flashlight at him, but the figure ducked, grabbing Eric by the throat and throwing him to the ground with a strength that didn't seem human. Nathan lunged at him with the fire poker, but the man dodged again, his movements unnaturally quick. I charged forward, knife in hand, aiming for his side, but he caught my wrist mid-swing, twisting it until I dropped the blade. Pain shot through my arm and I fell to my knees, gasping. For a moment I thought this was it, that we were all going to die here in this cabin, far from help, with no one knowing what had happened to us. But just as the figure raised his hand to strike, there was a loud bang, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Heather stood in the doorway, Nathan's hunting rifle in her hands, the barrel still smoking. The figure staggered, blood blooming across his chest. But he didn't fall. Instead, he turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. Heather fired again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. But still, he didn't go down. It was as if the bullets had barely slowed him. Nathan grabbed me, pulling me to my feet as we all backed toward the door. The figure stumbled but kept coming, his hollow eyes locked on us. "Get to the car," I shouted, shoving Lisa and Eric toward the door. We ran outside, piling into the car as Heather fired one last shot. The figure finally fell, collapsing in the doorway, but something told me this wasn't over. Nathan slammed the car into gear and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the man behind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we told the local sheriff what had happened. He sent a team to investigate, but when they arrived, the cabin was empty. No sign of the man, no blood, nothing. The sheriff chalked it up to stress, an overactive imagination after a long weekend in the woods. But we knew what we'd seen. The man at the cabin wasn't just a hiker. He wasn't even human. And he's still out there. My name is Mike Hewitt, and in the summer of 1987, I found myself standing outside a cabin deep in the Allegheny Mountains. What was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my girlfriend Liz turned into something I still can't shake, even after all these years. Back then I was 28, working as a mechanic in Pittsburgh, looking for a break from the grind. Liz had found the cabin rental in some local flyer. It seemed perfect, cheap, remote, and nestled right up against the national forest where you could hike for days without seeing another soul. We left early on a Friday, her beaten-up sedan packed with groceries, hiking gear, and enough beer to last a week. The roads grew narrower, less maintained, and by the time we turned onto the final gravel stretch, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in. Trees loomed overhead, branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. It felt like we were driving straight into the mouth of something ancient and unwelcoming. Liz didn't seem to notice, though. She was all smiles, excited to leave civilization behind for a few days. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, a simple wooden structure with a wraparound porch and a tin roof. It stood alone in a small clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. No neighbors, no roads nearby, just us and the endless woods. Perfect, I thought, for a little peace and quiet. The first night was uneventful. We grilled some steaks on a rusty old grill we found in the shed, drank a few beers and turned in early. The silence out there was unnerving. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the call of some unseen bird. Liz was out like a light, but I lay there staring at the ceiling, wide awake. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, but deep down I knew something felt wrong. The next morning we decided to hike one of the trails that led into the forest behind the cabin. Liz loved hiking, and I figured it'd do me some good to clear my head. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in some places, but we pressed on, the trees swallowing us up as we moved deeper into the woods. The deeper we went, the more I noticed things that felt off. First, it was the silence. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves. Then there were the carvings. At first they were subtle, small symbols etched into the bark of trees. Nothing I recognized, just strange, jagged lines and circles. Liz shrugged them off, saying they were probably left by kids or hunters, but I wasn't so sure. After a few hours of walking, we came across a clearing. In the center of it was something that stopped us both in our tracks, a pile of animal bones bleached white by the sun. Deer, I think, though it was hard to tell. Some of the bones were arranged in strange patterns, almost like they'd been placed there intentionally. Liz took a step back, her face pale. "Let's head back," she said quietly. The walk back felt longer. Every step felt like we were being watched, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us. But the trail stayed empty. When we finally made it back to the cabin, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves on edge. Liz tried to laugh it off, but I could tell she was spooked too. That night things got worse. We'd just finished dinner when we heard it. A low, rhythmic knocking sound coming from the front of the cabin. Liz looked at me, her eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The knocking stopped the moment I opened the door. I shone the light into the woods, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but as I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye. On the porch, just a few feet from the door, was a small pile of stones stacked neatly on top of each other. I hadn't noticed it before, and I knew for a fact it hadn't been there earlier. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. I kept the flashlight by my side, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for something, anything to show itself. The next morning, Liz wanted to leave. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell by the way she kept glancing at the door at the woods beyond. We packed up, but before we could even get the car started, the knocking returned. This time louder, more insistent, like someone was hammering on the side of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight again, but before I could even step outside, the door burst open and a man lunged at me. He was tall, gaunt, his clothes dirty and torn. His eyes were wide, wild, like he hadn't slept in days. He was holding a knife, the blade glinting in the sunlight. I barely had time to react before he swung at me. I ducked, the blade missing my face by inches. Liz screamed, backing away, her hands covering her mouth. I tackled the man, slamming him into the porch railing, but he was stronger than he looked. He threw me off like I weighed nothing, sending me crashing into the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. There was no reasoning with him, no trying to talk him down. His eyes were fixed on me, his expression one of pure, unbridled rage. He lunged again, and this time I wasn't so lucky. The knife sliced across my arm and I cried out in pain, stumbling backward. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a broken piece of the porch railing, and swung it at him. The wood connected with his head, and he staggered back, dazed, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He came at me again, this time knocking me to the ground, the knife aimed right at my throat. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to kick him off me, sending him sprawling across the porch. I was on my feet in an instant, grabbing Liz and pulling her toward the car. We fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. The man was already back on his feet, charging at us, the knife raised high. Just as he reached us, I slammed the car door shut and floored the gas. The tires spun in the gravel before finally catching, and we shot down the driveway, the man's figure shrinking in the rear-view mirror. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we called the police. They sent a few officers to the cabin, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. No sign of him, no tracks, nothing. Just the cabin sitting empty in the woods. They didn't believe us, of course, said it was probably just a drifter or a squatter looking for a place to stay. But I knew better. There was something wrong with that man, something not right in his head, and I knew deep down that we'd only barely escaped with our lives. Looking back, I still can't explain what happened. All I know is that I'll never step foot in those woods again. The cabin's still out there, I'm sure, waiting for its next visitors. But I won't be one of them. Last night I heard that knocking again. My name is Jack Dunhill. It's 1991 and I'm in a small cabin near the Hiawatha National Forest. I wasn't supposed to be here, not really. The weekend had been booked for someone else, but they'd canceled last minute and the old lady who ran the place offered me a discount if I came up right away. I needed the break, a chance to clear my head from a messy divorce, so I threw my gear into the truck and drove up from Lansing without much thought. The cabin wasn't anything special. A small wood-paneled room with a stone fireplace and a few deer heads hanging on the walls like it was a hunting lodge. But it was quiet, and that's what I needed. The first day went by uneventfully. I unpacked, made a fire, and wandered down to the lake that was about a mile away. The leaves had started to turn that rich gold and red, and the cool, crisp air felt good on my face. The calm was exactly what I had been craving after months of stress, lawyers, and shouting matches. I didn't realize how much tension had built up in me until it all started to fade in the solitude. I could hear myself think again. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to the cabin. I stopped for a moment when I saw something, a figure standing by the edge of the tree line. He was far off, but I could make out a man dressed in dark clothing just standing there staring at me. The hair on the back of my neck rose. I looked back at him, waiting for him to move or do something, but he didn't, just watched. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I waved, thinking maybe it was just someone passing through, but he didn't respond. When I turned to head back inside, my skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. After a few minutes of glancing over my shoulder, I saw the figure disappear back into the trees. Maybe it was just a local out for a walk, but something felt off. That night I lay awake longer than I should have. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just nerves or exhaustion, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wind, I'd find myself listening intently, waiting. When sleep finally came, it was restless. The next day I decided to explore the area. The forest was beautiful, tall, dense pines that stretched for miles in every direction. I hiked along the shoreline of the lake, taking in the view and trying to shake off the unease from the previous night. As the hours passed, I felt better. By the time I got back to the cabin, the incident with the figure seemed distant, like a trick of the mind. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon again, I found myself growing anxious. I hadn't seen anyone all day, not even another hiker or fisherman. The silence, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. It was then that I heard it, footsteps. At first they were faint, barely audible, but as I strained to listen, they grew louder, closer, until I was sure they were coming from right outside the cabin. I shot up from my chair, my pulse quickening. The footsteps stopped and everything went still again. My heart hammered in my chest as I slowly approached the window, trying to peer through the dark. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I waited a few moments, breathing shallowly, straining to hear anything out of place. But the only sound was the wind. For a second I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone was walking around outside? I doubted they'd take it seriously. Instead, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and sat down with my back against the wall, feeling more foolish by the minute. The next morning I went for a walk along the edge of the forest, hoping that maybe I'd spot something to explain the noises from last night. I found nothing, no signs of anyone having been there, no footprints in the dirt, just the quiet, vast emptiness of the woods. But the sense of being watched was back, stronger than ever. By noon I couldn't shake the paranoia that there was someone just out of sight, observing me from the trees, the way the branches seemed to sway unnaturally. The flicker of movement I thought I saw in the shadows. It all felt wrong. I made my way back to the cabin, the sky darkening with an approaching storm. The air grew thick and heavy and the trees rustled in the wind, the sound like a low, distant whispering. I rushed inside as the first drops of rain started to fall. The storm hit hard with thunder cracking through the sky and rain lashing against the windows. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were unmistakable, heavy, deliberate. They circled the cabin, slow and methodical, like someone was checking every corner. My breath hitched as I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth. gripping it tightly as I stood by the door, listening. There was a knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, almost polite tap. My stomach dropped. I held my breath, waiting. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the poker. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. For a long moment I just stood there, my heart thudding in my chest. Then the door rattled. Someone was trying to open it. I backed away, panic rising in my throat. "Who is it?" I demanded, louder this time. Still no response, but the door handle continued to shake. The window next to it was small, but I crept toward it, careful not to make too much noise, and peeked through the corner of the curtain. There he was, the same man I'd seen at the edge of the tree line. His face was partially hidden by the hood of his jacket, but I could see his eyes, dark, unblinking, staring right at me through the glass. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The door rattled harder now, and then a low, steady voice broke through the storm outside. "Let me in." It wasn't a request, it was a command. My mind raced. I wasn't about to let this guy in, but I also didn't know what he wanted. I reached for the phone, my hand trembling, and dialed 911. Nothing. The line was dead. The man outside began to pound on the door, each hit louder and more violent than the last. I could hear the wood starting to splinter. My pulse roared in my ears as I backed toward the fireplace, grabbing the only weapon I had, a rusty old hatchet I'd found in the shed earlier that day. The door crashed open, and there he was, tall, gaunt, with wild eyes that glinted in the dim light of the cabin. He didn't say a word, just lunged at me, arms outstretched. I swung the hatchet, catching him in the side. He grunted, but it barely slowed him down. I swung again, harder this time, but he knocked me to the ground with a violent shove. The wind howled through the open door as the storm raged on outside. I scrambled to my feet, swinging wildly, adrenaline and terror surging through me. He dodged my blows with an unsettling ease, his face twisted in a cold, emotionless stare. I barely managed to deflect his next attack, using the handle of the hatchet to block his fists, but then out of nowhere, he faltered. His movement slowed, and I saw a flash of confusion in his eyes. He staggered, clutching his side where I'd hit him, blood seeping through his jacket. I didn't wait for him to recover. I charged at him, shoving him back toward the door. He stumbled, lost his footing, and fell backward into the storm. I slammed the door shut, bolting it before collapsing against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long moment I just sat there shaking, the hatchet still gripped in my hand. The pounding on the door had stopped. The only sound now was the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I don't know how long I waited there, staring at the door, expecting him to come crashing back in at any moment. But he didn't. I peered through the window again, and the clearing was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my back against the wall, the hatchet still clutched in my hand, watching the door and windows, every creak and groan of the cabin twisting my nerves tighter. I tried to tell myself it was over, that he was gone, but the doubt gnawed at me. The storm raged on, and I could barely see through the rain-smeared windows, my imagination filling the shadows with his shape, waiting. By dawn, the storm had calmed and pale light filtered through the fog hanging low over the forest. I forced myself up, my muscles stiff from hours of tension. I checked outside carefully, my pulse racing as I stepped out onto the muddy ground. There was no sign of him, no footprints in the mud, no blood trail, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished with the storm. I packed up my things and got in the truck, not bothering to lock the cabin door behind me. The drive back to Lansing felt surreal, my mind racing with what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to go to the police, but what could I say? That a stranger attacked me in the middle of a storm and then disappeared? I knew they'd write it off, maybe think I'd had too much to drink or let stress get the best of me. But I know what I saw, those dark, unblinking eyes, the command in his voice as he demanded to be let in. It wasn't something I could explain, nor something I wanted to dwell on. Yet I knew that face would stay with me, creeping into my thoughts in quiet moments, the memory pressing down like a weight on my chest. It's been months since that night. I've tried to move on, tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, some kind of strange fever dream brought on by exhaustion. But every now and then in the dead of night, I'll catch myself listening, straining to hear through the silence of my empty apartment. And sometimes I swear I can hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone walking just outside my door. My name is Caleb Hartwell, and it was 1978 when I decided to rent a cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Virginia. I was there with 3 friends, Tommy, Jake, and Reggie, lifelong pals looking to reconnect after too many years of drifting apart. Life has a way of doing that, making the people you swore you'd never lose touch with fade into the background. So we figured a weekend up in the mountains, away from the noise and clutter of our lives, would do us all some good. The place we rented was a cozy wooden cabin tucked deep into the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It had the rustic charm we were looking for. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place with a fireplace, a couple of rooms, and the kind of isolation that city life could never offer. We packed the usual: booze, cards, a couple of fishing rods for the nearby lake, and hoped to spend a few nights reliving the old days. Tommy had been the one who suggested the spot. He had this knack for finding hidden gems like that, always claiming he'd heard about them through word of mouth. "This place," he said as we arrived, "is perfect. No one to bother us for miles." I glanced at the dense forest surrounding the cabin, its trees looming like sentinels guarding the quiet land. Something about it made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as just being out of my element. The first day was uneventful. Drinks by the fire, sharing stories about how life had changed. Jake had gotten married. Tommy was still living the bachelor life. And Reggie, well, he'd been through some tough times, having just gotten out of a bad relationship. But all in all, we were just happy to be away from everything. That first night we slept soundly, lulled by the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind outside. But the second night, things changed. It started with the noises. Reggie was the first to mention it, hearing something just after midnight, a low thump from the woods outside. He figured it was just an animal. "Probably a deer or something," he said, not giving it much thought. Tommy laughed, half joking that it was a bear, maybe even a Bigfoot. Jake, who was usually the more serious one, didn't join in on the jokes. He kept glancing out the window like something had him spooked. By the third night, the sounds had grown louder. I remember lying awake, staring up at the dark ceiling, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the thumping anymore. There was this scraping, like something was dragging itself through the underbrush. And then came the smell, a pungent, sickly odor that seemed to waft through the cracks of the old wooden cabin. Reggie woke up in the middle of the night, coughing and gagging from it. "Something's dead out there," he muttered, wiping his face with his sleeve, but we couldn't find any source for the smell. The next morning, things took a turn. We found the footprints. Massive, inhuman tracks pressed deep into the mud around the cabin. They didn't belong to any animal I knew of, certainly not a bear. These prints were clawed, wide, and they circled the cabin, leading deeper into the woods. Tommy, always the curious one, insisted we follow them. Against my better judgment, we did. We must have hiked for about an hour. The air growing thicker the deeper we went into the woods. The forest felt wrong, like we shouldn't be there, like the trees were pressing in on us. Eventually we reached a clearing, and that's when we saw it. There, hanging from the branches, were bones, animal bones, deer maybe, but strung up like ornaments swaying in the breeze. Below them, in the center of the clearing, was a fire pit. Long, cold. It looked like someone had been here recently, though there were no signs of people. Just those bones and the smell, stronger now, almost unbearable. Reggie turned to me, his face pale. "We should go." That's when we heard it. This low, guttural sound, like something trying to speak but not quite managing it. It came from the tree line and we all froze. For a second, no one moved. Then Tommy, always too bold for his own good, shouted, "Who's there?" The sound came again, closer this time. We ran. I don't remember how we made it back to the cabin. It was all a blur of branches snapping underfoot, my heart pounding in my ears. When we finally reached the cabin, we slammed the door shut, locking it tight. For a while, no one spoke. Tommy paced, muttering something about how it must have been some kind of animal, maybe even a prank, but the rest of us knew better. That night, the real terror began. The noises returned, but this time they were accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circled the cabin, pacing just beyond the windows. The smell was back too, stronger than ever. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, the air thick with fear. Jake stood by the window staring out into the darkness. "It's out there," he whispered, his voice trembling. Then came the knock. At first it was a soft tap on the door, like someone was gently asking to be let in. But then it grew louder, more insistent. Bang, bang, bang. We huddled in the center of the room, none of us daring to open the door. Reggie grabbed the poker from the fireplace, his knuckles white as he gripped it tight. Tommy tried to calm us down, saying it was probably just the wind or some local kids playing a prank, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The door shook as something slammed against it, hard enough to rattle the hinges. The windows trembled in their frames. I don't know how long we sat there staring at the door, waiting for it to break open, but it felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a long while we didn't move. Eventually Jake peeked out the window, his face pale. "It's gone," he whispered. The next morning we found more tracks outside, larger this time, deeper. Whatever it was, it had been right at our door, clawing at it. We needed to leave. Tommy, still trying to play the skeptic, wanted to stay another night, but the rest of us weren't having it. We packed up and left as fast as we could. On the drive back, no one spoke. We were too shaken, too scared to make sense of what had happened. We never talked about that weekend again, not in detail. But I'll never forget the smell, the footprints, or the sound of those footsteps circling the cabin. Years later, I found out about the local legend, something called a rougarou, a creature that stalks the woods, half man, half beast, hunting those who venture too far into its territory. I don't know if that's what we encountered, but whatever it wasn't human, and I'm lucky to be alive to tell the story. The rougarou is what haunted us. My name is Derek Sawyer, and it was the summer of 1987. I was deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina. It wasn't my first time staying at a remote cabin, but something about this one felt off the moment we pulled up. I had rented it with a couple of old buddies from college, Tim, who worked for a law firm in Charlotte, and Mike, who had taken up teaching after a failed venture into journalism. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, the kind that blocked out the sun once it started to dip past noon. We were all looking for a break, some time away from the chaos of our day-to-day lives. Tim was getting burnt out from corporate life. Mike was feeling the weight of his students' expectations, and I had my reasons, though I wasn't sure I was ready to talk about them. The cabin was supposed to be an escape. For a weekend, we could pretend that deadlines and responsibilities didn't exist. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, had a few beers, and spent the afternoon hiking a nearby trail. Tim complained about the heat, and Mike kept stopping to take pictures of everything, convinced he'd write an article about the serenity of the Appalachian wilderness. I, on the other hand, felt tense. There was this feeling that crept up on me, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up for no reason. The woods seemed too quiet at times, as if the birds and insects decided to stop and listen. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation messing with me. That night, after grilling steaks on the cabin's old rusted BBQ pit, we settled in around the fire pit outside. The stars were clear, the air cool. It should have been perfect. Tim cracked jokes and Mike spun one of his usual stories about some weird crime case he'd read in the papers, but I was barely listening. My attention kept drifting back toward the trees. The shadows felt thicker, like something was lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting. "Derek, you still with us?" Tim's voice snapped me out of it. He tossed an empty beer can toward me, grinning like an idiot. "Yeah, just tired, I guess," I muttered, trying to shake off the unease. "You've been weird since we got here," Mike said, raising an eyebrow. "If you're scared of the woods, you can say so." I laughed it off, though my voice sounded strained even to me. "I'm fine. Just had a long week." We stayed up late that night, but by midnight, Tim and Mike were half asleep in their chairs and I was left alone with the dying embers of the fire. The feeling of being watched was stronger now and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up stretching and glanced toward the cabin. That's when I saw it, a shape just at the edge of the woods. It was tall, too tall to be a person with a silhouette that seemed wrong. Its limbs were long, unnaturally so, and it moved in a way that made my stomach churn. Slow, deliberate, like it knew I was watching but didn't care. For a second I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it shifted, stepping closer to the clearing, and I saw the glint of something in the moonlight. Eyes, large and glowing a faint sickly yellow. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I didn't want to freak out Tim and Mike. Maybe part of me didn't want to admit I was seeing something I couldn't explain. I just turned and headed inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning I convinced myself it had been a dream. We spent the day fishing at a nearby creek, and for a while everything seemed normal. But as we hiked back to the cabin in the late afternoon, we noticed something strange. Deep scratches in the bark of several trees. They were spaced too far apart to be made by any animal I knew of. And the gouges were deep, like something had raked its claws against them with purpose. Bear, maybe? Tim suggested, though his voice lacked confidence. Mike shook his head. No way, not like this. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That night the atmosphere around the cabin felt heavier, the air thick with tension. We stayed inside this time playing cards and trying to distract ourselves from the weirdness. But by the time the clock hit midnight again, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness and I heard something faint, almost imperceptible at first. A scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. Tim grabbed a flashlight from his bag, cursing as he fumbled with it. The beam flickered on, casting long shadows across the cabin, and I saw the door. The scraping was coming from just outside. Something was trying to get in. Mike stood frozen, his face pale. What? What the hell is that? I moved to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The handle rattled, and then it stopped. Silence followed. For a long minute, none of us moved. Then the door creaked open just an inch and the flashlight flickered again, casting a weak light on the figure standing in the doorway. It was the same shape I had seen the night before, tall, gaunt, with glowing yellow eyes and long clawed hands that reached toward us. Its face, I can barely describe it. It was twisted, like it had been stretched and pulled into something almost human but not quite. Tim screamed, dropping the flashlight, and the creature lunged forward. Chaos erupted. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy rusted fire poker, and swung at it. The metal connected with a sickening crunch, but the thing barely flinched. It lashed out, its claws raking across my arm, sending a searing pain through me. Mike grabbed a kitchen knife, rushing at the creature, but it swatted him aside like he was nothing, sending him crashing into the wall. Blood poured from his head, and he didn't move. I was next. The creature turned its attention to me, those glowing eyes locking onto mine. It moved fast, faster than anything that size should, and before I knew it, I was on the floor, its claws pressing into my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But then, something snapped inside me. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was the desperation, but I managed to bring the fire poker up again, jabbing it into the creature's throat. This time it reacted. It let out a horrible gurgling sound and staggered back, clawing at its neck. I didn't waste time. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the knife from the floor and drove it into the creature's side. It shrieked, a sound that made my ears ring, and collapsed, twitching and writhing on the floor. For a moment I thought it was over, but then it started to move again, slower this time, dragging itself toward the door. I grabbed Tim, who was in shock, and we hauled Mike to his feet. We didn't look back as we ran out of the cabin and into the woods, sprinting through the trees in the dead of night. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, miles away from the cabin. By the time we got there, Mike was conscious but dazed, his face pale and streaked with blood. We flagged down a passing car and got to a hospital. The authorities never found the creature. They searched the cabin, but all they found were the scratches on the walls and the bloodstains on the floor. They didn't believe us, of course. Who would? But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. That thing, whatever it was, I think it's still out there. Appalachian black dog. My name is Caleb Ryder. It's 1985, and we're in the Cascade Mountains of Washington near Mount Baker. We were just 3 friends looking to reconnect, me, Jimmy Walters, and Luke Morrow. We hadn't seen each other in a couple of years, so we rented this cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. It was supposed to be a chance to catch up, share some beers, and maybe do a little hiking. But if I had known what waited for us out there, I never would have come. Jimmy had always been the adventurous type. He worked as a firefighter and had a physique to match. He was loud, brash, and a bit of a daredevil, always looking for a thrill. Luke, on the other hand, was quieter, more introspective. He worked as a school teacher, and though he wasn't as physically imposing as Jimmy, he had this calm confidence about him. Me? I'm somewhere in between. I've worked construction most of my life, so I'm used to the hard work, the dirt, and the heavy lifting, but I like my peace and quiet. That's probably why this cabin retreat seemed like a good idea to me. It was the perfect middle ground, enough adventure for Jimmy, enough solitude for me and Luke. The cabin itself was old, nestled between thick trees and overlooking a small creek. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms, a rickety porch and a stove that looked like it had seen better days. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and there wasn't another cabin for at least a few miles. Isolation was part of the appeal, but looking back I realize it was a mistake. The first night was quiet. We built a fire, cooked some food, and swapped stories. Jimmy brought out a deck of cards and we played poker for hours, laughing like we hadn't in years. Around midnight the wind picked up, howling through the trees like it wanted to knock the cabin over. But we didn't care. Jimmy made jokes, Luke listened, and I kept dealing the cards. It was almost normal, just 3 guys in the woods. The trouble started the next morning. We were up early making coffee on the stove when we heard something moving outside. At first we thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the noise was too steady, too deliberate, like footsteps. I went to the window, but all I saw was the thick forest and the early morning mist hanging over the trees. I chalked it up to the woods playing tricks on my mind, but Jimmy wasn't convinced. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight even though the sun had already risen. Luke and I followed him out, not really expecting to find anything. But as we stepped out onto the porch, the sound stopped. "You hear that?" Jimmy whispered. We stood still, listening. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was as if the whole world had decided to hold its breath. Then, without warning, there was a loud crash from the trees ahead of us, like something big had just fallen or been thrown. Jimmy clicked on his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, even though the morning light was strong enough to see. The beam hit nothing but trees and the occasional patch of underbrush. We walked a little further into the woods, Jimmy leading the way, me and Luke hanging back. The whole time my gut was telling me to turn back to get out of there, but Jimmy was stubborn. He pushed ahead, calling out to whatever was out there as if daring it to show itself. And then we saw it, a figure maybe 30 feet ahead of us, crouching low behind a tree. It was big. At first I thought it was a man, but then it moved. Too fast, too low to the ground. It darted behind another tree, vanishing from sight before any of us could react. "What the hell was that?" Luke whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Jimmy replied, but he was grinning, like this was all some kind of game to him. "Let's go find out." "No," I said, stepping back. "This isn't right." But Jimmy didn't listen. He took off, heading in the direction the thing had gone. Luke followed him, and against my better judgment, I went with them. The forest was dense, making it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. We kept moving, deeper and deeper, until we were so far from the cabin I wasn't sure we'd find our way back. Then, the footsteps started again, this time louder, closer. It was circling us, moving just out of sight. "Show yourself," Jimmy yelled, spinning around, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Then it did. It stepped out from behind a tree maybe 20 feet away. I still don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't human. It was tall, at least 7 feet, but it was hunched over like an animal. Its skin was a pale, sickly gray, and its limbs were too long, too thin. Its eyes were black, voids that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. Luke froze. Jimmy swore under his breath, raising the flashlight like a weapon. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know," Jimmy said, his voice low. "But we need to get out of here." We started backing away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The thing just stood there watching, waiting, and then without warning it moved. Fast. Too fast for something that size. It was on us in seconds. Jimmy swung the flashlight, but the thing knocked it aside like it was nothing. It slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. Luke screamed, stumbling backward, and I grabbed a branch off the ground, swinging it wildly. It didn't do much good. The thing was strong, too strong. Jimmy was fighting it, but it had him pinned. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and it lunged for his throat. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed a rock and smashed it into the back of the creature's head. It let out this horrible screech and reared back, giving Jimmy just enough time to scramble to his feet. "Run!" I yelled, and we did. We didn't stop until we were back at the cabin, slamming the door behind us. My heart was racing, and Jimmy was bleeding from a gash on his arm, but we were alive. Luke was pacing, muttering to himself, trying to make sense of what just happened. "What the hell was that thing?" Jimmy asked, wincing as he wrapped his arm in a towel. "I don't know," I replied, looking out the window. The forest was quiet again, but I knew it was still out there, watching us. We spent the next few hours trying to figure out what to do. Leaving the cabin meant going back out there, but staying didn't feel much safer. Eventually, we decided to make a break for the truck. It was parked about a quarter-mile down the dirt road, and if we could make it there, we could get the hell out of these woods. We packed up what little we had and stepped outside, sticking close together. The forest was still eerily quiet, and every snap of a twig had me on edge. But we didn't see anything. Not at first. We were almost to the truck when we heard it again, the footsteps this time louder, faster. I looked back and saw it running through the trees, coming straight for us. "Go!" I shouted, pushing Jimmy and Luke ahead of me. We sprinted toward the truck, the thing gaining on us with every step. I could hear its breathing, its feet pounding the ground behind us. Jimmy reached the truck first, yanking the door open and diving inside. Luke was right behind him. I was the last one fumbling with the door handle when I felt something grab my ankle. I kicked back, hitting something solid, and the grip loosened just enough for me to pull myself into the truck. Jimmy floored the gas and we tore down the dirt road, the thing chasing us for at least 100 yards before finally disappearing into the trees. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, and even then we kept driving, not saying a word. None of us wanted to talk about what we'd seen, what had almost happened. We just wanted to get as far away from those woods as possible. Later I looked it up, tried to figure out what it was. The descriptions all pointed to the same thing. I didn't believe in folklore before, but after that weekend I had no choice. It was a Wendigo.